The forge fires of Medusa 7 had burned for 10,000 years, their molten hearts feeding the Imperium's endless hunger for weapons and war. Yet on this day, as the twin suns of the Hadron system cast their dying light across the industrial sprawl, something stirred in the depths that had not walked among mortals for millennia. The air itself seemed to thicken as reality bent around an ancient presence, and from the searing heat of the planetary core, Vulcan stepped forth into a galaxy he no longer recognized. The Primarch of the 18th Legion materialized in the shadow of towering manufactorums, his massive frame wreathed in the residual energy of his teleportation. In his gauntleted hands, he held the final artifact of his great work, the Engine of Woes, last of the 9 relics he had scattered across the stars in ages past. Its recovery had taken him from the Eye of Terror to the galactic rim, through battles that would have broken lesser beings and trials that tested even his perpetual nature. Yet now, as he stood upon the world where his journey had begun, Vulcan felt no triumph, only a growing dread that gnawed at his immortal heart. The forge world spread before him like a vision from the depths of hell, where once proud artisans had labored in service to humanity's betterment. Now only the grinding machinery of endless production remained. The air reeked of promethium fumes and something else, something that made his enhanced senses recoil in disgust. Fear, pain, death. The very atmosphere was saturated with human suffering on a scale that defied comprehension. Vulcan moved through the industrial maze with the silence of falling ash, his drake-scale cloak flowing behind him like liquid shadow. Each step took him deeper into the heart of the manufactorum complex, where the sounds of industry gave way to something far more sinister. Voices raised not in song or prayer, but in desperate pleas for mercy. The crack of weapons fire, the wet sound of bodies hitting metal flooring. He found them in Manufactorum Delta 7, where the great fusion forges had once shaped adamantium into tools of creation. A crowd of perhaps 200 souls knelt in the shadow of silent machinery, their hands bound behind their backs with industrial wire. Men, women, children, all bearing the calloused hands and soot-stained faces of honest laborers. Their crime, according to the Imperial Guard officers overseeing the execution, was harboring treasonous thoughts against the God Emperor's divine will. The commissar in charge was a lean man whose face bore the ritual scars of absolute faith. He paced before the kneeling civilians like a predator, savoring the hunt, his bolt pistol gleaming in the forge light. "By the authority of the Holy Inquisition," he declared, his voice echoing off the metal walls, "you stand accused of harboring seditious thoughts against our most sacred Emperor. Your factory quotas have fallen short of Imperial standards for 3 consecutive months. This can only be the result of willful rebellion against the divine order." A woman in the front row, barely more than a girl, her face streaked with tears and soot, dared to raise her voice. "Please, my lord, we worked as hard as we could. The machines are old, breaking down. We tried to repair them, but we lack the materials." The commissar's bolt pistol barked once. The girl's head exploded in a spray of blood and bone fragments, her body toppling forward to stain the deck plating red. "Silence!" he roared. "Your excuses are heresy. Your failures are treason. The Emperor demands perfection, and you have given him weakness." Vulcan felt something crack inside his chest, not bone or flesh, but something deeper. Something that had sustained him through 10 millennia of warfare and sacrifice. He remembered another time, another world, when he had first knelt before the Emperor of mankind in the shadow of Mount Deathfire. His father had spoken then of a future where humanity would stand united, where the strong would protect the weak, where knowledge and compassion would triumph over ignorance and fear. "These are not your enemies, my son," the Emperor had said, his voice gentle as he gestured toward the Nocturnian people who watched from a distance. "They are your charges. Your purpose is not to rule them, but to guard them. Not to break them, but to forge them into something stronger. Remember this, Vulcan. True strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the courage to protect what is precious." The memory burned like acid in Vulcan's mind as he watched the commissar raise his weapon toward the next victim, a man whose only crime was clutching a small metal tool, perhaps salvaged from the factory floor in desperate hope of feeding his family. The bolt pistol's muzzle aligned with the man's forehead, and Vulcan saw not an enemy of the Imperium, but one of the very souls his father had entrusted to his care. "Stop!" The word came out as barely more than a whisper, yet it carried with it the weight of worlds. The commissar froze, his finger tightening on the trigger, but not yet firing. The assembled guardsmen turned toward the source of the voice, their laser guns swinging to bear on the massive figure emerging from the shadows. Vulcan stepped into the forge light, and for a moment the entire chamber fell silent. He stood nearly 3 meters tall, his armor the deep green of Nocturn's volcanic glass, marked with the flame motifs of his legion. The engine of woes hung at his side, its surface crackling with barely contained power. But it was his eyes that made even the hardened guardsman step backward, eyes that burned with the fury of a star gone nova, yet held within them a sadness deeper than any ocean. "I said stop," Vulcan repeated, his voice now carrying the full authority of his station. "Lower your weapon, Commissar. These people are under my protection." The Commissar's scarred face twisted into a sneer of contempt. "And who might you be to interfere with the Emperor's justice, stranger? Some rogue Astartes who has forgotten his place? I have the authority of the Inquisition behind me. Stand aside, or be branded traitor alongside these heretics." Vulcan's response was to reach up and remove his helm, revealing features that belonged in the legends of a bygone age. Skin dark as volcanic glass, eyes that glowed with inner fire, and the unmistakable bearing of one who had walked among gods and shaped the fate of worlds. Several of the older guardsmen gasped in recognition, their weapons wavering as the impossible truth dawned upon them. "I am Vulcan, Primarch of the Salamanders, Lord of the 18th Legion, son of the Emperor of mankind," he said, each word falling like hammer blows upon the souls of all who heard them. "And you, Commissar, are a disgrace to everything my father fought to build." The Commissar's bolt pistol swung toward Vulcan's chest, but before he could fire, the Primarch moved. Faster than thought, faster than fear, he crossed the distance between them and seized the man by the throat. The Commissar's feet left the ground as Vulcan lifted him effortlessly, his grip tightening until bones began to crack. "You execute innocence in his name," Vulcan growled, his voice carrying the rumble of distant thunder. "You pervert his vision into something monstrous. You have forgotten what we fought for." The Commissar's struggles grew weaker as his windpipe collapsed. "Let me remind you." The crack of the Commissar's neck echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. Vulcan released the corpse, watching it crumple to the deck plating, before turning his burning gaze upon the assembled guardsmen. Some had already thrown down their weapons and fled. Others stood paralyzed by the revelation that one of the legendary Primarchs walked among them once more. A few, driven by fanaticism or fear, raised their lasguns and opened fire. The loss beams struck Vulcan's armor and scattered harmlessly, their energy absorbed by ceramite plates forged in the heart of dying stars. He moved among the remaining soldiers like death incarnate, his massive hands breaking necks and crushing skulls with methodical precision. There was no joy in the killing, no satisfaction, only the grim necessity of protecting those who could not protect themselves. When the last of the executioners lay dead, Vulcan turned to the kneeling civilians. Many wept openly, unable to comprehend that they had been saved by legend itself. Others stared in mute shock at the carnage that surrounded them. The Primarch knelt before them, his massive frame somehow managing to appear less threatening as he brought himself closer to their level. "You are free," he said, beginning to cut their bonds with precise movements of his combat blade. "Return to your homes. Tell no one of what transpired here, at least not yet. Dark times are coming, and you must be ready." As the civilians fled into the maze of the Manufactorum, one figure remained, an old man whose weathered hands spoke of decades spent working metal and flame. He looked up at Vulcan with eyes that held no fear, only wonder and a deep, abiding sadness. "My lord," the old metalworker said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We heard the stories, passed down through generations of forge workers. We remembered the old ways, when the Salamanders walked among us as protectors, not conquerors. We kept the faith, even when faith seemed dead. But tell me, what has become of the dream? What has become of the future your father promised?" Vulcan felt the weight of 10,000 years settle upon his shoulders like a mantle of lead. Around them, the forge fires continued to burn, but their light seemed dimmer now, tainted by the blood that had been spilled in service to a corrupt ideal. He thought of the Commissar's words, of the casual brutality that had become the Imperium's standard, of the fear he had seen in every human face since his return. "The dream," Vulcan said finally, his voice heavy with grief and growing anger, "has become a nightmare, but perhaps it is not too late to wake from it." As the old man disappeared into the shadows of the Manufactorum, Vulcan stood alone among the dead. In the distance, alarms began to wail as word of the slaughter reached the planetary command. Voxcasters crackled to life, carrying reports of a rogue Astartes who had murdered Imperial officials and freed condemned heretics. The machinery of retribution was already grinding into motion, and Vulcan knew that soon this world would burn as countless others had burned before it. Yet as he gazed upon the blood-stained deck where innocents had knelt in chains, Vulcan felt something crystallize within his ancient heart. For too long he had slumbered, while his father's dream rotted from within. For too long he had trusted others to preserve what he and his brothers had died to build. No more. The forge fires of Medusa, 7 burned brighter that night, fed by more than promethium and plasma. They burned with the fury of a Primarch awakened, and the galaxy would soon learn what happened when the most compassionate of the Emperor's sons finally reached the limit of his mercy. The Vox transmissions reached Inquisitor Mordian Vex 3 hours before dawn, crackling through the void with the urgency of a dying man's confession. He stood in the command chamber of his strike cruiser, Divine Judgment, studying the tactical displays that showed Medusa 7's industrial sprawl when the first reports began flooding in from the Forge world's surface. A commissar dead, an entire execution detail slaughtered, condemned heretics freed from righteous justice, and at the center of it all, a figure that defied classification, a warrior of impossible size and presence who had moved through the Emperor's servants like death incarnate. Vex was not a man easily troubled by reports of violence. In his 47 years of service to the Holy Inquisition, he had ordered the destruction of entire star systems and watched billions burn for the sin of harboring doubt. His augmetic left eye, a gift from a grateful tech adept whose world he had saved from genestealer infestation, recorded every detail with mechanical precision. His scarred hands, marked by decades of close combat with heretics and demons, remained steady as he activated the hololithic displays. Yet something in these reports made the grafted neural implants at the base of his skull itch with unease. "Show me the picked captures again," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of one who had broken empires with a word. The servitor skull hovering at his shoulder projected grainy images captured by surveillance cogitators throughout Manufactorum, Delta 7. The quality was poor, distorted by electromagnetic interference from the forge works, but the essential details were clear enough. A figure in power armor of ancient design, a helm bearing the flame motifs of the 18th Legion, and most troubling of all, the casual ease with which this unknown warrior had ended the lives of trained Imperial servants. The Inquisitor's aide, a pale young woman named Seraphine, whose psychic talents had saved his life on more than one occasion, approached with data slates containing preliminary analysis. "My lord," she said, her voice carefully modulated to convey respect without familiarity. "The cogitator analysts have completed their initial review. The armor design predates standard Astartes patterns by several millennia. The proportions suggest gene-enhanced physiology beyond even space marine norms. And the weapon signatures?" She hesitated, her psychic senses clearly troubled by what she had witnessed in the recordings. "Speak plainly, Seraphine," Vex commanded, turning his augmetic eye upon her with mechanical precision. "What did your abilities sense in these images?" The young psyker shuddered visibly, her hands trembling as she gripped the data slate. "Power, my lord. Ancient power that burns like a star in the warp. I have felt such energies before, only in the most sacred reliquaries of the ecclesiarchy, or in the presence of the Adeptus Custodes. Whoever this warrior is, he bears the mark of the Emperor's own design. But there is something else. Something wrong. The psychic resonance carries traces of rage, of disappointment, so profound it could shatter worlds." Vex absorbed this information with the cold calculation that had made him one of the Ordo Hereticus's most feared agents. The implications were troubling beyond measure. An unknown warrior, with power rivaling the Emperor's own guardians, loose upon an imperial world and actively protecting those condemned by lawful authority. Such a figure could not be permitted to exist, regardless of his apparent origins or noble intentions. The Imperium's survival depended upon absolute obedience to established order, and any deviation, no matter how seemingly righteous, was heresy of the most dangerous kind. "Mobilize all available assets," he ordered, his voice cutting through the command chamber like a blade. "I want 3 companies of stormtroopers, a full squadron of Valkyrie gunships, and every servo skull in the sector deployed to Medusa, 7 within the hour. Contact the Grey Knights Fortress Monastery on Titan and request immediate assistance. Tell them we have a potential demonic incursion requiring their expertise." He paused, considering the magnitude of the threat this unknown warrior represented. "And prepare the cyclonic torpedoes. If this contamination cannot be contained, we may need to cleanse the entire world." Seraphine's face went pale at the casual mention of Exterminatus protocols. "My lord, surely the situation has not escalated to such extremes. The Forge world produces vital materials for 17 different sectors. The loss of production alone would—" Vex silenced her with a gesture that carried the weight of absolute authority. "The Imperium has survived for 10,000 years not through sentiment, but through decisive action against any threat to its stability. This unknown warrior has already demonstrated his willingness to kill Imperial servants in defense of condemned heretics. Such behavior cannot be tolerated, regardless of the economic consequences." His augmetic eye whirred as it focused on the tactical displays. "Ready the torpedoes. We may have need of them sooner than you think. The hours that followed saw a mobilization of Imperial might that would have been excessive for a small war, much less the capture of a single rogue warrior. Stormtroopers descended from orbit in armored drop pods, their carapace armor gleaming like black beetles in the forge light. Valkyrie gunships swept through the industrial canyons, their searchlights cutting through the perpetual smog as they hunted for any sign of their quarry. Servo skulls by the thousand spread through the manufactorum complexes, their sensor arrays recording every movement, every thermal signature, every whispered conversation that might reveal the location of the one they sought. Yet despite this overwhelming display of force, the target remained frustratingly elusive. The warrior had vanished into the maze of industrial facilities as completely as if the earth had swallowed him, leaving behind only corpses and the growing certainty that the Imperium faced something beyond its understanding. Reports continued to filter in throughout the long night, sightings that proved false, thermal readings that led to empty corridors, and the mounting frustration of soldiers who had never before failed to locate their prey. It was near dawn when the breakthrough finally came, not from any sophisticated surveillance device, but from a terrified factory supervisor whose loyalty to the Imperium exceeded his fear of death. The man had witnessed the mysterious warrior entering the central command spire that housed the planetary governor's palace, moving with purpose toward the communications array that connected Medusa 7 to the broader Imperium. The implications were immediately clear. Whatever this figure intended, it involved the planet's ability to communicate with the outside galaxy. Vex received this intelligence aboard his strike cruiser as he prepared to descend to the planet's surface personally. The Inquisitor had donned his power armor, a relic of the Great Crusade era, its adamantium plates inscribed with purity seals and oath bindings accumulated over decades of faithful service. His force sword hung at his side, its disruption field generator humming with barely contained energy. At his belt, a bolt pistol blessed by 17 different saints waited to deliver the Emperor's judgment to any who dared oppose his will. "My lord," Seraphine reported as she joined him in the launch bay, her own carapace armor marked with the symbols of sanctioned psychers. "Long-range augurs have detected massive energy buildups within the planetary communication array. Whatever our target intends, he is preparing to broadcast something across the entire sector." The Inquisitor's blood turned to ice in his veins as the implications became clear. A rogue warrior with apparent access to archaeotech weapons, preparing to spread whatever heretical message had driven him to protect condemned criminals. The potential for corruption was limitless. A single transmission could plant seeds of doubt in millions of minds, undermining the faith that held the Imperium together. Such a catastrophe could not be permitted to occur. "Launch the Thunderhawks," he commanded, his voice carrying an edge of urgency that his subordinates had rarely heard. "We end this now, before whatever poison this warrior carries can spread beyond this world. And ready the cyclonic torpedoes for immediate launch. If we cannot stop his transmission, we will ensure it dies with him." The flight to the planetary surface was a journey through hell made manifest. The industrial atmosphere of Medusa 7 burned their throats, despite the protection of their armor's filtration systems. The twin suns cast everything in shades of red and orange that reminded Vex uncomfortably of the blood he had spilled in the Emperor's name. As they descended toward the command spire, the Inquisitor found himself offering prayers to saints whose names had been forgotten by all but the most learned scholars, seeking divine guidance for what he suspected would be the most crucial battle of his career. The Thunderhawk set down on the spire's landing platform with a grace that belied its brutal design. its assault ramp dropping to reveal the strike force that Vex had assembled for this moment. 20 stormtroopers in carapace armor, their hell guns charged and ready. 5 battle psychers whose minds had been shaped into weapons by decades of training and conditioning. And at their head, an Inquisitor whose faith in the Emperor's will burned brighter than the forge fires that surrounded them. They found him in the central communication chamber, standing before the massive Vox array that connected Medusa 7 to the broader galaxy. The figure was even more imposing in person than the picked captures had suggested, nearly 3 meters of gene-enhanced perfection wrapped in armor that bore the craftsmanship of a bygone age. His drake-scale cloak flowed around him like liquid shadow, and the weapon at his side thrummed with barely contained power that made every psyker in Vex's retinue whimper in barely suppressed fear. Yet it was the warrior's face that truly gave the Inquisitor pause. Features carved from volcanic glass, eyes that burned with inner fire, and an expression of such profound sadness that it made Vex's augmetic implants ache with sympathetic resonance. This was not the face of a heretic or a madman, but of someone who had seen the galaxy's darkest truths and found them wanting. "Stand down, warrior," Vex commanded, his force sword crackling to life as he stepped into the chamber. "By the authority of the Holy Inquisition, I order you to surrender yourself for questioning. Your actions have been noted and will be judged according to Imperial law." The giant figure turned slowly, his burning gaze settling upon the Inquisitor, with an weight that seemed to press against Vex's very soul. When he spoke, his voice carried the rumble of distant thunder and the authority of ages beyond counting. "I am Vulcan, Primarch of the 18th Legion, Lord of Nocturn, and son of the Emperor of mankind," he said, each word falling like a hammer blow upon the assembled Imperial servants. "And you, Inquisitor, serve a corruption of everything my father sought to build." The chamber fell silent, save for the humming of machinery and the barely audible whispers of prayers from the stormtroopers. Several of the battle psychers fell to their knees, overwhelmed by the psychic pressure that radiated from the figure before them. Yet Vex remained standing, his faith in Imperial doctrine stronger than any awe he might feel for legends made flesh. "Even if you speak truth, Primarch," he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he faced, "you have violated Imperial law. You have murdered loyal servants of the Emperor and protected those condemned by righteous judgment. The Inquisition's authority supersedes all others in matters of heresy and corruption. You will surrender, or you will be destroyed." Vulcan's expression shifted, sadness giving way to something far more dangerous. "The Inquisition," he repeated, his voice heavy with contempt. "An organization that burns children for the crime of asking questions, that executes entire populations for failing to meet impossible quotas, that perverts my father's vision into a nightmare of endless suffering." He took a step forward, and every weapon in the chamber swung to track him. "Tell me, Inquisitor, what has become of the Imperium my brothers and I died to create?" Vex felt the weight of 10,000 years settle upon his shoulders as he stared into the eyes of legend itself. Yet his faith remained unshakable, forged in the fires of absolute certainty that had sustained the Imperium through its darkest hours. "The Imperium endures," he said, raising his force sword to point at the Primarch's heart. "It endures because we make the hard choices that lesser men cannot. Because we sacrifice the few to save the many. Because we understand that survival requires strength, and strength requires sacrifice." His augmetic eye focused on Vulcan with mechanical precision. "Even Primarchs must bow to that truth, my lord. Even you." The communication array behind Vulcan began to hum with building power, its ancient machinery preparing to broadcast whatever message he had come to deliver. In the distance, Alarms wailed as the strike cruiser Divine Judgment prepared its cyclonic torpedoes for immediate launch. The fate of an entire world, and perhaps the galaxy itself, hung in the balance of the next few moments. And in the silence that followed, as legends and mortals faced each other across the gulf of 10,000 years, Vulcan's eyes blazed with the fury of a star preparing to go nova. The communication array erupted in a cascade of sparks and flame as Vulcan's fist smashed through its primary cogitator core. The massive Vox transmitter that had connected Medusa 7 to the broader Imperium died with a sound like the death scream of a machine spirit, its ancient circuits overloading in a brilliant display of electrical fury. Yet even as the machinery died around him, the Primarch's message had already been sent, broadcast across 17 sectors before Inquisitor Vex could silence him. Citizens of the Imperium, Vulcan's words had thundered across the void, reaching worlds where millions labored under the crushing weight of Imperial rule. You are not alone. The Emperor's dream of unity and protection has been perverted into nightmare. But it is not yet dead. Rise. Defend yourselves. Remember that you are not slaves, but the very reason we fought among the stars. Now, as alarms wailed across the Forge world and the first explosions bloomed in the distance where cyclonic torpedoes struck the outer settlements, Vulcan stood among the wreckage of his father's vision and felt something crystallize in his immortal heart. Not rage, though that burned bright within him. Not despair, though he had witnessed enough to break lesser souls. What filled him was purpose, cold, implacable and devastating in its clarity. Inquisitor Vex lay unconscious against the far wall where Vulcan had hurled him, his power armor cracked and his force sword shattered into useless fragments. The Primarch could have killed him as easily as breathing, but some part of him still recoiled from unnecessary slaughter. The other Imperial servants, stormtroopers and battle psychers alike, had fled when their master fell, carrying with them tales that would spread terror through Imperial ranks across the sector. The sound of approaching aircraft filled the air as Vulcan strode from the communication chamber into the broader facility. Through the reinforced windows, he could see Valkyrie gunships sweeping toward the command spire like predatory birds, their weapon systems glowing with deadly intent. Behind them came heavier craft, Thunderhawks bearing the silver and steel of the Grey Knights, the Emperor's own demon hunters dispatched to deal with what the Inquisition had classified as a potential warp-spawn incursion. Vulcan's laugh was bitter as volcanic glass. To face the Emperor's most faithful servants in battle seemed a fitting irony for what the Imperium had become. The Grey Knights would not come seeking dialogue or understanding. They knew only purification through bolt and blade, and they would not hesitate to destroy him if they believed he represented a threat to humanity's survival. The first wave of attackers struck as Vulcan descended into the spire's industrial levels, where frightened workers huddled in makeshift shelters. Lass beams and bolt rounds filled the air as stormtroopers poured through breached entrances, their carapace armor gleaming in the forge light as they advanced with military precision. These were not the corrupted commissars Vulcan had executed in the Manufactorum. They were honest soldiers following orders they believed righteous, and their deaths would weigh upon his conscience even as necessity demanded their destruction. "Citizens of Medusa 7, Vulcan called out, as he moved among the cowering workers, his voice cutting through the chaos of battle like a blade through flesh. The time for hiding is past. They come not to arrest the guilty, but to silence any who might speak truth. Stand with me, and I will give you what the Imperium has forgotten, the strength to defend yourselves." The first to answer was an old woman whose hands bore the scars of 40 years working the forge lines, her face etched with lines of suffering that spoke of quotas missed and punishments endured. She took up a piece of rebar from the rubble around them, hefting it like a club as she moved to stand beside the Primarch. Others followed, men and women who had spent their lives in service to an empire that viewed them as expendable resources, now offered the chance to fight for something greater than mere survival. The battle that followed would be remembered in Imperial records as the Medusa 7 Insurrection, though those who witnessed it knew it as something far more significant. Vulcan led his improvised army through the industrial maze with tactical genius that belonged to an age of heroes, turning every factory and warehouse into a fortress, every maintenance corridor into an ambush point. The guardsmen found themselves fighting not just one transcendent warrior, but an entire population that had suddenly remembered what it meant to refuse. Yet it was when the Grey Knights arrived that the true scope of Vulcan's fall became clear. They descended into the forge complex like avenging angels, their psychically warded armor gleaming with holy inscriptions, their nemesis force weapons crackling with power that could banish demons back to the warp. 3 of them advanced on Vulcan's position, Brother Captain Mordrak, whose blade had tasted the blood of 1,000 heretics, and his battle brothers Vorth and Senion, veterans of campaigns that had saved entire sectors from corruption. "In the name of the Emperor," Mordrak declared as he raised his Nemesis Force sword, its blade wreathed in flames that burned with more than mere heat, "I command you to submit to purification, demon thing. Your masquerade as one of the lost Primarchs ends here." Vulcan's response was to draw his own weapon, the ancient warhammer known as Doomtremor, its head wreathed in the fires of Nocturn's heart. The weapon had been crafted by his own hands in the dark days following the Dropsite massacre, when he had thought himself the last loyal son remaining to his father. Now it would taste the blood of the Emperor's most faithful servants, and the irony was not lost upon him. "I am no demon," Vulcan replied, his voice carrying the weight of 10,000 years of service and sacrifice. "I am exactly what I appear to be, a son of the Emperor, awakened to see what his Imperium has become. And I find it wanting." The duel that followed shook the very foundations of the command spire. Mordrak moved with the speed and precision of centuries of training, his nemesis blade weaving patterns of death that would have destroyed any mortal foe. Yet Vulcan was no mortal. He was a demigod forged in the Emperor's own image, and his warhammer met each strike with thunderous impact that sent shockwaves through the reinforced structure around them. Brother Vorth fell first, his helmet caved in by a blow that struck faster than thought. Senion lasted longer, his force weapon scoring deep wounds across Vulcan's armor before the Primarch's backhand sent him crashing through a ferrocrete wall. And finally, Brother Captain Mordrak, hero of 100 campaigns, slayer of the demon Prince Malthius, guardian of the Imperium's darkest secrets, died as he had lived, fighting to his last breath for the Emperor he had never seen. The silence that followed was deafening. Across the Forge world, Imperial forces ceased their advance as word spread through Vox networks and data streams that could not be silenced. A Primarch lived. A Primarch had returned. And he had killed Grey Knights, the Emperor's own chosen, in direct combat. It was then that the Salamanders arrived. They came not in a single wave, but in carefully coordinated strikes that spoke of centuries of tactical excellence. Drop pods thundered down from orbit like falling stars, disgorging green-armored warriors whose flame weapons turned the industrial landscape into a hellscape of burning promethium and molten metal. At their head came figures Vulcan recognized despite the millennia that had passed: Chapter Master Korad, his scarred features grim beneath his drake helm, and Captain Xerus of the Third Company, whose prowess in battle had earned him the epithet Fireborn. Yet as his gene sons advanced through the smoking ruins toward his position, Vulcan could see the terrible conflict that raged behind their helmeted faces. These were his children, crafted from his own genetic legacy, raised on legends of his compassion and wisdom. They had dreamed of his return for 10,000 years, praying to the Emperor that their Primarch might walk among them once more. Now that dream had become a nightmare of impossible choices. "My lord," Korad's voice carried across the battlefield as the Salamanders formed a loose circle around their gene father, their bolters lowered, but not quite aimed away. "We received word of your return from the Inquisition. They claim you have turned traitor, that you protect heretics and murder loyal servants of the Emperor." His voice cracked with the weight of the words. "Tell us this is not so. Tell us you haven't fallen as our uncle Primarchs fell." Vulcan looked upon the faces of his sons, some hopeful, some fearful, all desperate for answers that would make sense of the impossible situation they faced. Behind their disciplined ranks, he could see the civilians he had rallied, wounded but unbroken, clutching whatever weapons they had found. Imperial guardsmen who had thrown down their arms rather than fire upon innocent workers. And in the distance, the flames of burning settlements where Inquisitor Vex's cyclonic torpedoes had begun their work of purification. "I have not fallen," Vulcan said finally, his voice carrying to every corner of the battlefield. "I have awakened. Look around you, my sons. See what we have become. We who were meant to be humanity's protectors have become its oppressors. We who swore to shield the innocent now execute them for the crime of weakness. We have forgotten everything worth fighting for." He gestured toward the burning horizon, where millions died for the sin of existing on a world where their Primarch had chosen conscience over obedience. The Inquisition would burn this entire world rather than admit that their authority might be questioned. They would sacrifice every soul on Medusa 7 to maintain their grip on power. And they do this in the name of the Emperor, in the name of our father who dreamed of a galaxy where humanity might know peace. Chapter Master Korad stepped forward, his ancient armor scarred by 1,000 battles fought in the Emperor's name. "What would you have us do, Lord? The Imperium may be imperfect, but it is all that stands between humanity and extinction. Without order, without hierarchy, without the strength to make hard choices, we would fall to chaos within a generation." "Then let us build something better," Vulcan replied, raising Doom Tremor so that its flames cast dancing shadows across the assembled warriors. "Let us remember what we were created for. Not to rule through fear, but to protect through strength. Not to demand obedience, but to earn loyalty. Not to burn worlds, but to kindle the light of hope in humanity's darkest hour." He looked each of his gene sons in the eye, seeing the conflict that raged within them reflected in their postures and the set of their shoulders. "I will not ask you to betray oaths sworn in good faith, but I will ask you to choose. Will you serve the Imperium as it is, or will you help me forge it into what it should have been?" The silence stretched like a taut wire as 30,000 years of conditioning warred with genetic loyalty in the hearts of the Salamanders. Some, the younger warriors, those whose faith in Imperial doctrine burned brightest, began to raise their weapons. Others, veterans who had seen too many worlds burn for insufficient faith, held their ground but did not advance. And a few, led by Captain Xerus, knelt in the ashes of their father's battlefield and spoke words that would echo through history. "We stand with you, my lord, not as traitors, but as the sons of Vulcan. Let the galaxy burn if necessary. We will forge it anew in the Emperor's true image. The die was cast. The Salamander's legion was split, perhaps forever. And in the fires of Medusa 7, the Promethean War had truly begun. The silence that followed Captain Xerxes' declaration stretched like a blade poised to fall. Across the smoking battlefield of Medusa 7, nearly 400 salamanders stood frozen between duty and devotion, their gene-enhanced hearts torn between loyalty to the Imperium that had shaped them and the father who had given them life. The kneeling figures around Xerxes, perhaps a third of the assembled warriors, represented more than simple allegiance. They embodied a fracture that would echo through the ages like the crack of breaking ceramite. Chapter Master Korad removed his drake helm with movements that seemed to age him 1,000 years, revealing a face scarred by centuries of warfare and etched with lines of anguish deeper than any physical wound. His dark skin bore the ritual brands of Nocturn's fire trials, marks that connected him to traditions older than the Imperium itself. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 10 millennia, spent in faithful service to both Emperor and Primarch. "My lord," he said, the words seeming to tear themselves from his throat, "you ask us to choose between two sacred oaths, to serve the Emperor who created us, or to follow the Father who shaped us. How can any son make such a choice without damning his soul to eternal torment?" Vulcan's burning gaze softened as he looked upon his oldest living son, remembering the young warrior who had knelt before him on Nocturn's ash plains during the Great Crusade. Korad had been among the first to receive the gene seed, one of the lucky few who had survived the transformation when such procedures were still experimental, and death claimed more aspirants than life. To see him now, torn between conflicting loyalties, was a knife thrust into the Primarch's immortal heart. "The choice is yours alone, old friend," Vulcan replied, his voice gentler than the molten iron that flowed through Nocturn's heart. "I will not command what conscience must decide. But know this, the Emperor I served, the Father who raised me from Nocturn's flames, would weep to see what his Imperium has become. The question is not whether to serve him, but how best to honor what he truly sought to build." Brother Sergeant Gowram of the 2nd Company stepped forward, his artificer armor bearing the scars of the Badab War and 17 other campaigns where salamanders had bled for Imperial glory. His voice shook with barely contained rage as he raised his bolt pistol toward his gene father. "Blasphemy! You speak of the Emperor as if he were merely mortal, subject to error and regret. He is the master of mankind, the Omnissiah's chosen vessel, perfect in all things. If the Imperium burns heretics and executes the weak, it is because his divine wisdom demands it." The bolt round that erupted from Gowram's weapon struck Vulcan center mass, its mass-reactive tip detonating against ceramite plates that had turned aside demon blades and Xeno's claws for 10,000 years. The Primarch staggered backward, dark blood streaming from the wound, yet his expression held no anger, only profound sadness at the necessity of what must follow. "So be it," Vulcan whispered, raising Doomtremor as Gowram's squad opened fire in support of their sergeant. "If you cannot be swayed by words, perhaps blood will teach what rhetoric could not." The battle that erupted was unlike anything the galaxy had witnessed since the dark days of the heresy. Brother fought brother with weapons blessed by the same techmarines, armor forged in the same forges, and hearts burning with identical zeal for different visions of the same cause. Lass beams and bolt rounds filled the air as tactical squads divided along lines of belief, some standing with their gene father, while others held fast to Imperial doctrine. Captain Xerxes led the Vulcanist faction, with the fury of a man who had waited 10,000 years to fight beside his Primarch, his power sword carved through loyalist armor with precision born of countless battles, each strike guided by perfect knowledge of Salamander's tactical doctrine. Behind him, Chaplain Elysius wielded his Crozius Arcanum like a weapon of divine judgment, the ancient relic blazing with psychic fire as he chanted not the litanies of Imperial faith, but older prayers, words spoken on Nocturn's shores when the galaxy was young. Yet the Loyalists fought with equal devotion, their faith in Imperial order burning as bright as any forge fire. Brother Captain Orthak of the 4th Company proved himself a master of urban warfare, turning every piece of rubble into a firing position, every broken wall into a fortress. His tactical genius had earned him honors during the siege of Vrax, and now he used those same skills against brothers who had once stood beside him in the shield wall of duty. The turning point came when Brother Sergeant Gorham, driven by fanatic zeal, charged directly at Vulcan with a melter bomb primed for detonation. The weapon's fusion core contained enough destructive power to reduce a battle tank to vapor, and Gorham's augmetic legs carried him forward at speeds that would have been impossible for unenhanced humans. His final words echoed across the battlefield as he triggered the device. For the Emperor's glory, for the Imperium eternal. The explosion that followed turned a 40-meter section of the battlefield into molten glass. When the flames cleared and the debris settled, those who remained saw something that shook their understanding of reality itself. Vulcan lay at the crater's center, his mighty frame torn nearly in half by the melter bomb's fury. Dark blood pooled beneath his still form, and for several heartbeats, even his gene-enhanced physiology seemed insufficient to sustain life. Then the impossible happened. Flesh began to knit itself back together with visible speed. Bones reformed from shattered fragments, and organs rebuilt themselves from scattered pieces. Vulcan's eyes opened with the light of stars being born, and he rose from his own death with the fluid grace of inevitability. The ancient secret that he had hidden even from his closest sons was revealed at last. He was perpetual, blessed or cursed with immortality that not even the most devastating weapons could permanently deny. "My lord," Captain Xerus breathed, his voice thick with awe and something approaching fear. You died. We all saw it. How is this possible?" Vulcan tested his newly reformed limbs with movements that seemed to encompass eternity. Around the battlefield, warriors on both sides had ceased fighting, their weapons lowered as they struggled to comprehend what they had witnessed. Even the most faithful among them had never seen resurrection performed outside of the Emperor's own legends. "I am as my father made me," Vulcan replied, his voice carrying new weight now that his greatest secret had been laid bare. "Immortal, so that I might protect humanity long after other guardians have fallen to dust. I have died before, under Conrad Kurz's torturer's tools in the fires of demon forges, beneath the claws of beasts whose names are forbidden to speak. Each time I have returned, because there is work yet to be done." Chapter Master Korad fell to his knees, his power armor's servos whining as they supported his suddenly trembling frame. "A perpetual," he whispered, the word carrying the weight of revelation, "like the Emperor himself. My lord, if this is true, if you carry his own divine nature within you, then perhaps—" His voice trailed off as the implications crashed over him like a tidal wave. "Then perhaps I speak with his authority when I say the Imperium has lost its way," Vulcan finished, extending a hand to help his oldest son rise. "I do not ask you to abandon your faith, Korad. I ask only that you consider what that faith truly demands. Look around you. See what we have become. Brothers killing brothers, not for heresy or corruption, but for daring to question whether mercy might be as valuable as strength. The chapter master's scarred features worked through emotions that had no names, duty warring with wonder, certainty crumbling before the evidence of divine favor. When he finally spoke, his words carried the finality of a verdict pronounced upon history itself. "Half the chapter will return to terror," he said, his voice hollow as a funeral bell. "They will report your resurrection to the High Lords and await judgment. They remain loyal to the Imperium as they understand it, and I will not ask them to forsake oaths sworn in good faith." He paused, meeting Vulcan's burning gaze with eyes that held their own inner fire. "But I will not abandon my Gene Father in his hour of greatest need. If you walk into darkness, my lord, then some of your sons will walk beside you, whatever the cost." The division that followed was conducted with military precision that could not disguise its emotional devastation. Companies that had fought side by side for centuries split along lines of doctrine and devotion. Veterans who had shared blood and glory found themselves on opposite sides of an ideological chasm that seemed to widen with each passing moment. Some partings were conducted with formal dignity, respectful salutes and wishes for honor in whatever battles lay ahead. Others dissolved into bitter recriminations that would echo in memories for generations to come. Brother Captain Orthak led the Loyalist contingent, nearly 200 Marines whose faith in Imperial order remained unshakable despite all they had witnessed. As they prepared for departure, he approached Vulcan with the bearing of a man walking to his own execution. "My lord," Orthak said, his voice carefully controlled, "I wish you to know that this division brings me no joy. You are my Gene Father, and I love you as sons love fathers throughout the galaxy. But I cannot follow where you lead. The Imperium is humanity's only hope against the darkness. Imperfect though it may be, it is all that stands between our species and extinction." Vulcan placed a hand on Orthak's shoulder, feeling the weight of choice that pressed down upon them both. "I understand, my son. Your loyalty does you honor, even as it breaks my heart. Go with the Emperor's blessing, and know that whatever others may say of this day, you acted according to your conscience." As the Loyalist Salamanders departed in their Thunderhawks, their contrails drawing lines of fire across Medusa 7's ash-darkened sky, those who remained felt the terrible weight of what they had chosen. They were no longer simply Space Marines of the 18th Legion. They were rebels against the only authority they had ever known, branded as traitors by association with their Gene Father's heresy. Captain Xerus stood beside Vulcan as they watched the departing ships disappear into the void, his scarred features reflecting the forge light that burned around them. "What have we done, my lord?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We have shattered the Legion, turned brother against brother, defied the Imperium itself. How many will die for this choice?" Vulcan's answer carried the weight of prophecy and the certainty of one who had seen empires rise and fall like waves upon an endless shore. "As many as necessary, my son. As many as it takes to remind the galaxy what we once fought for. The dream is not dead. It merely sleeps beneath the weight of 10,000 years of accumulated cruelty. But dreams can be awakened if one is willing to pay the price." In the distance, new fires began to burn as word of the Salamander's division spread across Imperial communication networks. Across the galaxy, Loyalist forces marshaled for war, while populations stirred with whispers of hope they had not dared voice in millennia. The Promethean War had claimed its first casualties, not in the bodies of the dead, but in the shattered bonds of brotherhood that had once seemed eternal. And in the ashes of that division, something new began to take shape. Not the rigid hierarchy of Imperial doctrine, but the flexible strength of those united by choice rather than compulsion. It would be tested in fires yet to come, tempered by battles that would shake the galaxy itself. But it would endure because it was built not on fear, but on the simple truth that some things were worth fighting for, even when the cost seemed beyond bearing. The forge fires of Medusa 7 burned on, feeding on more than promethium and plasma. They burned with the passion of choices made in desperate hours, and the galaxy would learn what happened when even angels could bear no more. The forge fires of 3 worlds burned bright against the void, as Vulcan's rebellion spread like wildfire through the Hadron sector. What had begun as a single Primarch's desperate intervention on Medusa 7 had become something far more dangerous, a coordinated campaign against the very foundations of Imperial rule. In the span of 17 solar days, the Lord of the 18th Legion had shattered 10,000 years of established order and proclaimed a war that would reshape the galaxy's understanding of loyalty, duty, and the price of absolute power. Standing in the command chamber of the strike cruiser, Forge Eternal, a vessel hastily renamed from its previous designation after its crew declared for the Primarch, Vulcan studied the tactical displays that showed his growing domain. Medusa 7 remained the heart of his operations, its manufactorums now producing weapons and armor for those who had chosen to follow him rather than the distant masters of terror. But it was no longer alone. Xerion Prime had fallen to his forces after a 3-day siege that ended when its own planetary defense forces opened the gates to welcome him as liberator. Kythera Majoris had surrendered without a shot being fired, its governor kneeling in the ash fields where Vulcan had landed and begging forgiveness for the atrocities committed in the Emperor's name. Captain Xerus approached his gene-father with the measured stride of a warrior who had found his purpose after millennia of questioning. His artificer armor bore fresh scars from the liberation campaigns, each mark telling the story of battles fought not for conquest, but for the simple right of human beings to exist without fear. In his hands, he carried reports from across the sector, intelligence that spoke of a galaxy stirring with whispers of hope and terror in equal measure. "My lord," Xerus said, his voice carrying the weight of momentous tidings. The Vox intercepts from across 7 sectors tell a remarkable tale. Civilian populations on 43 worlds have risen in open revolt against their Imperial governors. The uprisings began within hours of your first broadcast, spreading like flame through dry kindling. They cry your name as they storm the palaces of those who have oppressed them. Vulcan's burning gaze remained fixed on the displays, watching as more ships arrived in-system. Not Imperial reinforcements, but vessels carrying refugees from worlds where the mere mention of his name had become a death sentence. Entire families had abandoned their homes, willing to face the uncertain dangers of the void, rather than remain under the rule of commissars and governors who saw them as expendable resources. "And the cost?" the Primarch asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer would bring him no joy. "How many have died for the sin of believing that humanity might be worth protecting?" The numbers Xerus recited were staggering in their casual brutality. 12 worlds subjected to orbital bombardment when their populations refused to renounce Vulcan's message. 3 million civilians executed by firing squad for the crime of distributing copies of the Promethean Manifesto, a document that Vulcan had never written, but which had somehow emerged from the collective hopes of those who heard his words. Entire star systems placed under interdiction, their populations left to starve, rather than risk the spread of what Imperial authorities had classified as primarchal heresy of the first magnitude. "Too many," Vulcan said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of every soul that had paid for his choices. "Far too many. Yet the alternative is to abandon them to 10,000 more years of suffering, and that I will not do. The Emperor created us not to rule through fear, but to protect through strength. It is time the galaxy remembered that distinction." The War Council that followed brought together figures who would have been executed as traitors under any previous regime. Chapter Master Korad represented the Salamanders who had chosen to follow their gene-father into rebellion. Commander Lisette Vaughn spoke for the 100,000 Imperial Guard troops who had defected rather than fire upon civilians. Magos Harath IX of the Adeptus Mechanicus explained the industrial capacity that 3 forge worlds could provide to a cause dedicated to creation rather than destruction. Yet it was the presence of ordinary humans in that council chamber that truly marked the difference between Vulcan's rebellion and the failed uprising of Horus 10 millennia before. Workers from the manufactorums sat beside gene-enhanced warriors, their voices given equal weight as they planned campaigns that would determine the fate of sectors. The old woman who had first stood beside Vulcan on Medusa 7, Sister Corinne, as she was now known, had become something unprecedented in Imperial history, a civilian granted authority to speak for her people in matters of war and peace. "The Imperial Navy is massing at Hydra Caudatus," Magos Harath IX reported, his vox grill crackling with barely suppressed excitement at the tactical challenge they faced. 3 battle groups under Lord Admiral Korath, including the Dominus Aeternum and the Fist of Retribution. By our calculations, they command sufficient firepower to reduce these 3 worlds to molten slag within a matter of hours. Vulcan's laugh was like the rumble of distant volcanoes, carrying both humor and an edge of something far more dangerous. Let them come. They bring the tools of destruction, thinking that raw firepower will break the will of those who fight for something greater than mere survival. They have forgotten that the strongest weapons are forged not in the fires of hatred, but in the crucible of righteous purpose. The days that followed saw a transformation that would have seemed impossible to those raised on tales of the Great Crusade's glory. Vulcan worked alongside common laborers in the forge chambers, his mighty hands shaping adamantine and ceramite into weapons that bore no resemblance to standard Imperial patterns. These were tools of liberation rather than conquest, firearms designed to be maintained by ordinary humans, armor light enough for civilian defenders, yet strong enough to turn aside lass beams, and most remarkably, weapons that incorporated psychic dampening fields to protect their wielders from the mental conditioning that kept Imperial populations docile. Each weapon must tell the truth, Vulcan explained to a group of tech adepts, who watched in fascination as he forged a new pattern of lass rifle with techniques that predated the Mechanicus by millennia. Not the truth of firepower or kill ratios, but the truth of what it means to defend rather than oppress. Every trigger pulled in this war must be pulled by choice, not compulsion. Every life taken must be taken in defense of those who cannot defend themselves. The first test of these principles came when Lord Admiral Korath's fleet translated into the Medusa system with the thunder of reality torn asunder. 67 Imperial vessels arrayed in perfect battle formation, their weapon batteries charged and targeting systems locked onto the rebel worlds. Yet they found no cowering populations awaiting destruction, no orbital defenses that could be swept aside by superior firepower. Instead, they faced something that had not existed in the galaxy for 10,000 years, a fleet crewed entirely by volunteers. The ships that rose to meet the Imperial Navy bore names that spoke of hope rather than domination. Liberty's Dawn, Mercy's Promise, the Unbroken Chain. Their crews included former Navy personnel who had abandoned their oaths rather than participate in the slaughter of innocents, rogue trader dynasties who had grown sick of serving an empire that measured success only in suffering, and thousands of civilian volunteers who had learned to operate weapon systems in defense of their homes. Yet it was the message that Vulcan broadcast as the fleets closed for battle that truly marked the moment when local rebellion became galactic war. His words reached not just the combatants preparing to die in the void, but every inhabited world within 100 light-years, every ship traveling the warp routes, every listening post and monitoring station that served the Imperium's vast communication networks. Citizens of the galaxy, Vulcan's voice thundered across the void, carrying with it the authority of one who had walked among gods and shaped the fate of worlds. For 10,000 years, you have been told that suffering is the price of survival, that freedom is weakness, that mercy is heresy, that you must accept the death of your children, the starvation of your families, the crushing weight of quotas and tithes and punishments that serve no purpose save to remind you of your powerlessness. The tactical displays showed Imperial ships hesitating in their advance, as crews struggled to reconcile the voice of legend with the orders that demanded they ignore his words. On a dozen worlds, PDF commanders found their troops lowering their weapons rather than arresting those caught listening to the Primarch's broadcast. I tell you now that those lies die today, Vulcan continued, his words burning through the static of Imperial jamming efforts like fire through paper. The Emperor of mankind did not sacrifice himself upon the golden throne so that his Imperium might become a machine for the creation of suffering. He dreamed of a galaxy where humanity might know peace, where knowledge would triumph over ignorance, where the strong would protect the weak rather than exploit them. Lord Admiral Korath's response was to order an immediate attack, his battle barges opening fire with lance batteries that could crack continents. Yet the return fire that met his advance was unlike anything in his experience. Ships crewed by ordinary humans fought with the desperation of those defending their families, their commanders using tactics that prioritized the protection of civilian evacuation routes over military objectives. That dream is not dead, Vulcan's voice rang across the battlefield as explosions bloomed between the opposing fleets. It lives wherever citizens choose compassion over cruelty, wherever the strong refuse to exploit the weak, wherever hope burns brighter than fear. The corrupt officials who claim to rule in the Emperor's name call this heresy, but I call it the truest expression of his will. I call it the promise that was made when humanity first reached for the stars. The battle raged for 7 hours, a storm of lance fire and torpedo salvos that lit the void like a newborn star. When it ended, Lord Admiral Korath's fleet had been broken, not destroyed, for Vulcan's forces had prioritized the capture of Imperial vessels over their destruction, but scattered and demoralized by an enemy that refused to fight according to established doctrine. More importantly, the Primarch's message had been heard across the galaxy. On Terra itself, the High Lords convened in emergency session, as reports flooded in of uprisings on a scale not seen since the dark days of the heresy. Sector governors who had ruled through fear for centuries found their authority questioned by populations that had suddenly remembered what it felt like to hope. As the damaged Imperial ships limped away from the Medusa system, Vulcan stood in the observation deck of Forge Eternal and watched the evacuation shuttles returning from the battlefield. Each one carried rescued crew members from defeated Imperial vessels, men and women who had served the Imperium faithfully until the moment they found themselves facing an enemy who offered mercy rather than death. "My lord," Captain Xerus reported as he joined his Gene father at the reinforced viewing port. "Preliminary casualty reports indicate that 67% of the enemy fleet's personnel survived the engagement. Our medical teams are overwhelmed, treating Imperial wounded alongside our own. Many are requesting permission to join our cause." Vulcan nodded, unsurprised by the development. "The strongest chains are those we forge ourselves through choice rather than compulsion. Every Imperial citizen who joins us willingly is worth 100 who serve only through fear. Give them the choice. Return to Terra with our message, or help us build something better. But ensure they understand that the choice is theirs alone." In the distance, the forge fires of 3 worlds burned bright against the void, their light carrying across the darkness to touch worlds that had not seen hope in millennia. The Promethean War had truly begun, and with it came a question that would define the next phase of human history. Could an empire built on fear survive the return of one who remembered what they were meant to protect? The answer, Vulcan suspected, would be written in fire and blood across the galaxy itself. But for the first time in 10,000 years, that answer would be written by choice rather than compulsion, and that alone made the war worth fighting. The forge fires burned on, feeding on hope as much as Prometheum, and their light would not be easily extinguished. The flames of rebellion spread across the galaxy like wildfire through drought-stricken forests, consuming worlds that had endured millennia of Imperial oppression with an hunger that seemed to feed on its own momentum. In the 37 days since Vulcan's victory over Lord Admiral Korath, 79 worlds had declared independence from Terra's rule, their populations rising in synchronized revolts that spoke of careful coordination and shared purpose. Yet for every world that broke free from the Imperium's chains, 3 more burned under orbital bombardment as the High Lords chose to rule over ash rather than risk the spread of what they had classified as primarchal contagion. Standing in the strategium of Forge Eternal, as it translated through the Imperium toward the Calixis sector, Vulcan studied reports that painted a picture of a galaxy convulsing with change. The tactical displays showed supply lines stretching across dozens of systems, civilian evacuation routes that carried refugees toward worlds where they might find sanctuary, and most remarkably, a network of support that reached into the highest echelons of Imperial society itself. "The House Corvanis has declared for our cause," Captain Xerus reported as he approached his Gene father with data slates bearing the seals of nobility that few in the Imperium would dare forge. "Lord Militant Corvanis himself has pledged the resources of his trading fleet, 47 vessels, including 2 modified battlecruisers. His message speaks of decades spent watching Imperial governors execute his crews for the crime of questioning supply quotas that could not be met." Vulcan's burning gaze shifted to encompass the broader tactical display, where the names of rogue trader dynasties flickered like stars being born from the darkness. House Quintanus had opened their private shipyards to produce vessels for the Liberation Fleet. House Decabalus had begun smuggling weapons to rebel worlds through trade routes that Imperial authorities had thought secure. Most remarkably, House Kryn, whose loyalty to Terra had been considered absolute for 9,000 years, had declared their navigator bloodline's support for what their patriarch called the Emperor's true vision. "They risk everything," Vulcan said, his voice heavy with the weight of choices that would reshape the galaxy's balance of power. These noble houses trace their authority back to the Great Crusade itself. To declare against the Imperium means accepting that their children and grandchildren will be hunted as traitors for generations to come. Yet they choose to stand with us anyway. What does that tell you about the state of our father's realm? The answer came not from Xeros, but from an unexpected source, Navigatrix Prima Eleanor Kryn herself, who had arrived aboard Forge Eternal just hours earlier to personally pledge her house's support. She was a woman of middle years whose third eye blazed with the power that allowed humanity to traverse the warp, yet her voice carried the exhaustion of one who had seen too much suffering, justified by necessity. "It tells us that the Imperium's cruelty has finally exceeded even the tolerance of those who profit from it," she said, her words cutting through the Strategium's background, hum like a blade through silk. "My family has guided Imperial ships through the warp for 9 millennia, Lord Primarch. We have watched entire sectors stripped bare to feed the insatiable hunger of Terra's bureaucracy. We have seen populations starve so that their tithes might reach Imperial coffers, seen children press-ganged into service aboard ships they will never leave alive." She gestured toward the tactical displays that showed the growing rebellion's scope. "My navigator bloodline has witnessed horrors that would break lesser minds, demonic incursions that could have been prevented with better governance, rebellions that started with reasonable requests for aid, worlds that chose extinction rather than submit to impossible demands. We know that this corruption didn't begin with you, my lord. It began the moment the Imperium chose efficiency over compassion." The conversation was interrupted by the urgent chime of proximity alarms as Forge Eternal's auger arrays detected massive energy signatures at the edge of sensor range. The vessels that emerged from the warp bore the heraldry of 2 of the most respected Space Marine chapters in the galaxy, the crimson and gold of the Imperial fists and the black and silver of the Iron Hands. These were not garrison troops or second-line formations, but the inheritors of primarchal legacies, gene sons of Rogel Dawn and Ferrus Manus, come to face their wayward uncle in battle. Chapter Master Lysander, of the Imperial Fists, and Iron Lord Cardan Stronos, Xeris identified, as the tactical displays resolved the enemy formation. 27 battle barges and strike cruisers, supported by rapid strike vessels and bombardment platforms. They have positioned themselves to prevent our withdrawal from the system. Vulcan's expression grew thoughtful as he studied the approaching force. These were not the corrupted officials or misguided fanatics he had faced thus far, but warriors whose loyalty to the Emperor was absolute and whose tactical acumen had been proven in 1,000 battles. They would not be swayed by rhetoric or dismayed by his gene-enhanced presence. They had come to fulfill their duty as they understood it, whatever the personal cost. "Lysander," Vulcan said, the name carrying weight of recognition and something approaching respect. "I fought beside his chapter master during the War of the Beast. A good man, though his faith in Imperial doctrine runs deeper than the Mariana Trench. He will not be turned from his purpose through words alone." The communication that came from the Imperial Fist's flagship was both formal and deeply personal, broadcast on frequencies that reached every vessel in both fleets. Chapter Master Lysander's voice carried the authority of one who had never known defeat, and the sadness of one who truly understood what this confrontation would cost. "Lord Vulcan," Lysander said, his words carefully chosen to show respect while maintaining absolute resolve. "I greet you as a son greets his father's brother, with honor for what you were, and grief for what you have become. By the authority granted to me by the High Lords of Terra, and in the name of the Emperor himself, I order you to surrender yourself for judgment. Your rebellion has claimed countless lives, and threatens the stability of the Imperium entire." The response came not in words, but in the form of Vulcan himself, translating directly onto Lysander's flagship through the ancient teleportarium array built into Doomtremor's haft. The Primarch materialized in the center of the Imperial Fist's command deck with the fluid grace of inevitability, his massive frame wreathed in the energies of his passage. Around him, dozens of bolters swung to bear, but discipline held as Lysander raised a hand to forestall his warriors. "Chapter Master," Vulcan said, inclining his head with genuine respect. "You look well, considering the weight you bear. Tell me, do you sleep easily, knowing that worlds burn at your chapter's command? Do you find peace in the knowledge that children starve so that Terra's quotas might be met?" Lysander drew his storm shield and thunder hammer with movements practiced over centuries of warfare, yet his response carried none of the fanatic zeal that had marked lesser opponents. "I sleep poorly, Lord Vulcan, and I make no apologies for the hard choices that survival demands. The galaxy is dark and full of terrors that would consume humanity if we showed weakness for even a moment. The Imperium endures because men like me are willing to bear the burden of necessary cruelties. The duel that erupted between them was a thing of terrible beauty. Two masters of warfare testing their strength against the weight of history itself. Lysander fought with the disciplined fury of the Imperial fists, his thunder hammer striking with force that could pulverize tank armor, while his storm shield turned aside blows that would have shattered mountains. Yet Vulcan was Primarch-born, created by the Emperor's own hand to stand against threats that mortal warriors could not comprehend. Doomtremor met Thunderhammer in exchanges that sent shockwaves through the command deck's reinforced structure. Each blow carried the weight of ideological conviction, Lysander striking for the order he had sworn to preserve, Vulcan responding with the fury of one who had witnessed that order's corruption. Around them, Imperial fists and iron hands watched in stunned silence as legends battled for the right to define what loyalty truly meant. "You speak of necessary cruelty," Vulcan said, as his warhammer shattered Lysander's storm shield, sending the chapter master stumbling backward. "But tell me, at what point does necessity become convenience? When does protecting humanity become oppressing it? When does serving the Emperor's will become serving your own pride?" Lysander's response was to charge with the desperate courage of a man who knew defeat was approaching, yet refused to yield. His thunderhammer struck Vulcan's shoulder pauldron with enough force to crack ceramite, but the Primarch's counterblow sent him crashing through a bank of cogitators in a shower of sparks and shattered data crystals. You could have been something magnificent," Lysander gasped, as he struggled to rise, blood streaming from wounds that would have killed a lesser man. A beacon of hope in the darkness. Instead, you choose to tear down the only thing that stands between humanity and extinction. Vulcan knelt beside his fallen opponent, Doomtremor's flames dying to barely visible embers as he reached out to touch Lysander's forehead with surprising gentleness. "I am not tearing it down, nephew. I am trying to rebuild it into something worthy of what it was meant to be. The Emperor did not sacrifice himself so that his Imperium might become a machine for the creation of suffering. The mercy that followed was unprecedented in the annals of Imperial warfare. Rather than delivering the killing blow that tactical doctrine demanded, Vulcan helped Lysander to his feet and spoke words that would echo through the command deck and into the Vox networks that carried them across both fleets. "Return to Terra," the Primarch commanded, his voice carrying the authority of ages. "Tell the High Lords what you have seen here. Tell them that Vulcan lives, that his legion remembers its purpose, and that the dream of unity through compassion is not dead. Tell them that mercy is not weakness, but the greatest strength of all." As Lysander and his warriors departed under a truce that defied every precedent in Imperial military doctrine, Iron Lord Cardan Stronos approached the Primarch with movements that spoke of deep contemplation. The leader of the Iron Hands bore augmetic replacements for most of his original flesh, yet his remaining eye held an expression of something approaching understanding. "You spare those who came to destroy you," Stronos observed, his vox grill filtering emotions that pure flesh might have conveyed more clearly. "Yet the Imperium you seek to overthrow shows no such mercy to those who oppose it. How do you reconcile this contradiction?" Vulcan's answer came as he watched the Imperial Fist's fleet withdraw, their ships carrying word of his mercy to every corner of the galaxy. "I reconcile it by refusing to become what I fight against, Iron Lord. The moment we match cruelty with cruelty, we become indistinguishable from our oppressors. The revolution I led must be worthy of the galaxy we seek to create, or it becomes merely another form of tyranny." The tactical displays showed the broader scope of the conflict as reports flooded in from across the rebellion's expanding territory. On Mordian, Imperial Guard regiments had declared for Vulcan after witnessing their commissars execute an entire company for questioning orders to fire on civilians. The Forge world of Griffone 4 had begun producing weapons for rebel forces, its tech priests claiming that their loyalty belonged to knowledge rather than politics. Most remarkably, 3 Space Marine chapters, the Firehawks, the Steel Confessors, and the Crimson Castellans, had announced their intention to evaluate the Primarch's claims rather than immediately declaring him heretic. "The galaxy changes," Navigatrix Kryn observed as she studied the incoming reports. "Not through conquest or compulsion, but through example. Every world that sees your mercy rather than imperial cruelty becomes a beacon for others to follow. Every warrior who witnesses honor in place of brutality questions the doctrines he has been taught to revere." Yet even as the rebellion spread, the imperial response grew correspondingly fierce. Entire sectors were placed under martial law as inquisitorial task forces began systematic purges of anyone suspected of harboring sympathy for Vulcan's cause. The Adeptus Custodes themselves had been deployed from Terra, their golden forms appearing on worlds where the rebellion's influence grew strongest. And from the depths of the Eye of Terror came whispers that even the Chaos Gods watched with interest as the Imperium tore itself apart. "The price grows steeper with each passing day," Vulcan acknowledged as he studied reports of orbital bombardments and mass executions carried out in the Emperor's name. "Every victory we achieve, every world we liberate, costs the Imperium a piece of its soul. Yet the alternative is to abandon those who look to us for hope, and that I will not do." Captain Xeris approached with the latest tactical assessments, his scarred features reflecting the burden of command that all who served the Primarch had come to bear. "My lord, our intelligence networks report massive mobilizations across 17 sectors. The High Lords are calling in favors and activating reserve formations that have not seen action since the Macarian Crusades. They mean to end this rebellion through overwhelming force, regardless of the cost." Vulcan's response was to turn toward the observation ports that showed the void around them, where ships bearing the marks of a dozen different factions had gathered under the banner of his cause. Rogue trader vessels sailed beside converted civilian transports, their crews united not by compulsion, but by shared conviction. It was a sight that had not been seen since the Great Crusade itself. Humanity united in common purpose, rather than divided by fear and suspicion. "Let them come," the Primarch said, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy and the certainty of one who had seen empires rise and fall like waves upon an endless shore. "They bring the tools of oppression, thinking that raw firepower will break the will of those who fight for something greater than mere survival. They have forgotten the most basic truth of warfare, that an army fighting for something believes in will always triumph over one fighting only because it must. In the depths of the ship's forges, new weapons took shape under the guidance of Vulcan's own hands, tools of liberation rather than conquest, instruments of mercy rather than destruction. Each one bore inscriptions that spoke not of death and domination, but of hope and the promise that even in the galaxy's darkest hour, there remained those willing to fight for what was right. The fires of rebellion burned bright against the void, their light carrying hope to worlds that had not dared to dream in millennia. Yet with that hope came danger, as the forces of order marshaled their strength for a confrontation that would determine whether the dream of compassion could survive in a galaxy built on cruelty. The war was far from over. If anything, the hardest battles lay ahead, as those who profited from the current order prepared to defend their privileges with every weapon at their disposal. But for the first time since the Emperor's enthronement upon the Golden Throne, humanity had been reminded that there was more to strength than the ability to inflict suffering. And that reminder, Vulcan knew, was a force more powerful than any weapon ever forged. The dying light of Vos Tertius cast long shadows through the skeletal remains of Hive Primus as Vulcan walked alone among the ruins of Imperial majesty. 57 days had passed since his rebellion began on Medusa 7, and the galaxy burned with the fires of civil war that showed no sign of abating. Here, on a world that had once been the jewel of the Calixis sector, the Primarch sought solitude among the wreckage of civilization to contemplate the weight of choices that had reshaped the fate of billions. The Hive City had fallen not to orbital bombardment or enemy action, but to the simple withdrawal of Imperial support when its population declared for Vulcan's cause. Without the constant supply ships that fed its massive population, without the technical expertise that maintained its atmospheric processes, the great city had simply died, its people evacuated to worlds where they might find hope instead of slow starvation. The empty corridors and silent hab blocks served as a monument to the Imperium's casual cruelty, a testament to how easily it would sacrifice entire populations to maintain control. Yet it was here, among the ghosts of Imperial neglect, that the most dangerous hunters in the galaxy had finally cornered their prey. They came as golden lightning given form, materializing from teleportarium strikes that bypassed every defense the rebels had erected. Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's own companions, the Watchers of the Throne, warriors whose existence predated the Imperium itself. At their head strode Captain General Trajan Valoris, his ancient armor gleaming with the light of 10,000 suns, his guardian spear crackling with power that could unmake demons and shatter the will of lesser beings. "Vulcan of Nocturn," Valoris said, his voice carrying authority that had been granted by the master of mankind himself. "By the direct command of our liege lord, you will come with us to Terra. Your rebellion ends here, not in death, but in judgment before the one who gave you life." The Primarch turned from his contemplation of the dead city's skyline, his burning gaze meeting the golden figures that had arranged themselves around him with tactical precision. A dozen of the Emperor's finest warriors, each one a legend in their own right, each one capable of slaying space marines by the score. Yet Vulcan felt no fear as he hefted Doom Tremor, its flames responding to his emotions with light that cast dancing shadows across the ruined walls. "Judgment," Vulcan repeated, tasting the word like bitter wine. "And what crimes does the Emperor believe I have committed, Valoris? That I protected innocents from slaughter? That I reminded the galaxy what his dream was meant to achieve? That I refused to stand silent while his Imperium became a machine for the creation of suffering?" The answer came not in words, but in the liquid grace of custodian warfare. As the golden warriors moved to encircle their quarry, they fought with weapons forged in the earliest days of the Great Crusade, their every movement speaking of centuries spent protecting the most sacred being in human history. Yet even as they struck with precision that would have overwhelmed any mortal foe, Vulcan was no mere mortal. He was Primarch-born, created by the Emperor's own hand to stand against threats that transcended mortal understanding. The battle that erupted among the Hive's ruins was a thing of terrible beauty, a clash between the pinnacle of human achievement and the divine will that had shaped it. Guardian spears met Warhammer in exchanges that sent shockwaves through the reinforced structure around them, each blow carrying enough force to level hab blocks. Plasma and flame filled the air as weapons designed to slay gods were brought to bear in a confrontation that would have been impossible to imagine during the Great Crusade's glory days. Yet it was not weapons that decided the battle's outcome, but words spoken by Captain General Valoris as he pressed his attack with the fury of absolute conviction. "You think yourself righteous," he said, his guardian spear weaving patterns of death that forced even Vulcan to give ground. "You believe you act in defiance of our master's will. But tell me, Primarch, how do you think word of your resurrection reached the Inquisition so quickly? How do you believe Imperial forces found you so easily on world after world?" The revelation struck Vulcan like a physical blow, more devastating than any weapon the custodians could bring to bear. His counterattack faltered for a crucial moment, allowing Valoris to score a deep cut across his breastplate that sent dark blood streaming down ceramite plates forged in Nocturn's heart. "You speak in riddles," Vulcan said, yet his voice carried a note of uncertainty that had not been present before. "The Inquisition tracked me through standard surveillance networks and informant reports. My presence could not be hidden from their scrutiny." Valoris's response was to halt his attack entirely, his guardian spear lowering as he spoke words that would reshape Vulcan's understanding of everything he had fought for. "The Watchers of the Throne see all that transpires within the Imperial Palace, Primarch. We know which orders originate from the High Lord's ambition, and which carry the true will of our master. Did you truly believe that your father, the master of mankind, the architect of human destiny, was unaware of your return?" The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of wind whistling through the Hive's broken spires. Around the battlefield, the other custodians had ceased their attacks, their golden forms standing like statues, as their Captain General delivered truths that cut deeper than any blade. "He knows," Vulcan whispered, the words torn from his throat like fragments of his own soul. "He has always known. But if that is true, then why? Why does he permit the suffering? Why does he allow his Imperium to become what it has become?" The answer came not from Valoris, but from a presence that filled the ruined chamber like the light of a newborn star. The Emperor's psychic voice reached across the galaxy from his throne on Terra, touching Vulcan's mind with the gentle touch of a father welcoming home a long-lost son. The words that followed would echo in the Primarch's memory for the rest of his immortal existence. "My son," the Emperor's voice carried warmth that had been absent from his communications for 10 millennia. "You have done exactly what I hoped you would. Not what I commanded, for true virtue cannot be compelled, but what your conscience demanded when faced with corruption that threatened to consume everything we built together." Vulcan fell to his knees among the rubble, his massive frame shaking as the weight of revelation crashed over him like a tidal wave. "Father, if you knew, if you approved, then why did you not act yourself? Why did you allow the suffering to continue when you had the power to stop it? The Emperor's response carried the sadness of ages, the weight of choices that had shaped the fate of species, and the burden of knowledge that transcended mortal understanding. Because the Imperium must choose to be worthy of salvation, my son. For 10,000 years, I have watched my realm grow corrupt, becoming the very tyranny I sought to overthrow. Yet if I acted directly, if I imposed reform through divine mandate, what would be learned? How would humanity grow? The psychic presence intensified, sharing visions that showed Vulcan glimpses of possible futures, timelines where the Emperor's direct intervention had created not reform, but greater oppression, where divine command had replaced human choice entirely. He saw worlds where populations worshipped him not as protector, but as tyrant, where his will had become just another form of chains. You were always the most compassionate of my sons, the Emperor continued, his voice growing stronger as the connection deepened. Even when others believed mercy was weakness, you understood that true strength lay in the courage to protect rather than dominate. I knew that if anyone could remind the Imperium of its purpose, if anyone could force it to confront the monster it had become, it would be you. Captain General Valoris stepped forward, his ancient features reflecting emotions that few beyond the custodians had ever witnessed. The rebellion you lead, Lord Vulcan, serves a purpose greater than you realized. Every world that chooses compassion over cruelty, every Imperial servant who questions their orders rather than blindly obeying, every moment of mercy shown in place of expected brutality, these things force the Imperium to examine itself. The revelation that followed was perhaps the most devastating of all. The Emperor had not been passive during the long millennia of his entombment, but had been carefully orchestrating events to test whether humanity could evolve beyond the need for tyrannical rule. The gradual corruption of imperial institutions, the rise of fanatical cults, the increasing brutality of planetary governors, all of it had been permitted, not from indifference, but from the hope that eventually someone would stand up and say, "Enough." But the cost, Vulcan said, his voice breaking as he contemplated the billions who had died for this test, the countless innocents who had suffered while their God-Emperor waited for humanity to find its conscience. The price paid in blood and suffering. How can any purpose justify such agony? The Emperor's answer carried the weight of cosmic perspective, the understanding of one who had guided humanity's evolution since before recorded history. The alternative was worse, my son. Direct intervention would have created a species of eternal children, dependent on divine guidance for every moral choice. True maturity requires the freedom to fail, to choose wrongly, and to learn from the consequences. Humanity must become worthy of the galaxy I envisioned, not through compulsion, but through choice. As the psychic presence began to fade, leaving behind only the golden light of the custodians and the empty ruins of a dead city, Vulcan found himself facing a choice more terrible than any he had confronted. If the Emperor approved of his rebellion, if it served a divine purpose greater than mere reform, then what did that make him? A righteous crusader fighting corruption, or a pawn in a game so vast that mortal minds could barely comprehend its scope? "The choice is yours, Lord Vulcan," Valoris said, as he and his warriors prepared to depart, their teleportarium arrays charging for the journey back to Terra. "Continue your rebellion, knowing now that it serves our master's will, or return with us to the palace and receive new orders. But understand this: whatever you choose, the responsibility for its consequences rests upon your shoulders alone." The custodians vanished in flashes of golden light, leaving Vulcan alone among the ruins with knowledge that changed everything and nothing. His rebellion had the Emperor's approval, yet that approval came with the understanding that he had always been intended to play this role. The suffering he had witnessed, the corruption he fought against, the choices that had driven him to revolt, all of it had been foreseen, planned for, perhaps even orchestrated by a mind that operated on time scales measured in millennia. As he stood among the skeletal remains of Hive Primus, watching the distant stars through shattered transperistile, Vulcan contemplated the terrible burden that had been placed upon him. He was not just a Primarch in rebellion. He was the instrument of humanity's moral test, the catalyst for a transformation that might take centuries to complete. The question that remained was whether he could bear that knowledge without being crushed by its implications. In the distance, Vox transmissions carried word of new uprisings, new worlds declaring independence from Terra's rule, new hope kindling in hearts that had known only despair. His rebellion continued to spread, carrying with it the promise that change was possible. Yet now Vulcan knew the truth. He was not fighting against his father's will, but fulfilling it in ways that even he hadn't fully understood. The revelation should have brought comfort, but instead it brought a weight heavier than any armor he had ever worn. For if the Emperor had foreseen this rebellion, if he had approved of the suffering it would cause, what did that say about the nature of divine will? What did it mean to serve a father whose love was expressed through allowing his children to endure agony so that they might grow strong? The stars offered no answers, only the cold light of distant suns that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. But as Vulcan turned away from the dead city and began his journey back to the living worlds where his followers waited, he carried with him the certainty that some questions could only be answered through action, regardless of how terrible the cost might be. The rebellion would continue, not despite the Emperor's approval, but because of it. And in that continuation lay either humanity's salvation or its final damnation, a choice that no divine will could make, but which must be earned through the agonizing process of moral growth. The test was far from over. If anything, knowing its true purpose made the burden infinitely heavier to bear. The screams of the dying echoed across the ash fields of Mordian Prime, a symphony of anguish that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. 63 days had passed since Vulcan's encounter with the custodians, and the galaxy burned with a fury that consumed innocent and guilty alike in its inexorable advance. What had begun as a righteous rebellion against Imperial tyranny had become something far darker, a civil war that claimed lives by the millions, turning entire sectors into charnel houses, where brother fought brother with weapons blessed by the same forges. Vulcan stood atop the ruins of what had once been a cathedral dedicated to the Emperor's glory, watching as las beams and artillery shells tore through civilian evacuation convoys caught between opposing forces. Below him, Imperial Guard regiments that had declared for his cause exchanged fire with loyalist space marines, their battle raging through streets where thousands of non-combatants sought shelter from a war they had never chosen to join. The sight filled him with a horror deeper than any physical wound, the realization that his quest to protect humanity had become its greatest threat. The tactical reports that Captain Xeris delivered painted a picture of catastrophe on a scale that defied comprehension. 347 worlds now burned in open rebellion against Terra, their populations rising to throw off the chains of imperial oppression. Yet for every world that declared independence, 2 others faced orbital bombardment, as the High Lords chose to rule over Ash rather than permit the spread of what they termed primarchal heresy. The death toll had already exceeded that of some of the Imperium's smaller crusades, and showed no sign of abating. "My lord," Xerus said, his voice heavy with the weight of unwelcome tidings, "the casualty reports from the Segmentum Solar alone tell a tale that would break hearts made of stone. 43 million civilians dead in the crossfire, 112 million more displaced from their homes, seeking refuge on worlds already straining under the burden of war. The refugee camps overflow with orphaned children who cry for parents they will never see again." Vulcan's hands clenched into fists as he absorbed the magnitude of suffering that his choices had unleashed. Each number represented not just a statistic, but lives cut short, dreams shattered, families destroyed by the very war he had started to protect them. The Emperor's revelation that this served a greater purpose provided no comfort. If anything, it made the burden heavier. For now he knew that even divine approval could not absolve him of responsibility for the consequences of his actions. "Tell me," the Primarch said, his voice barely above a whisper, "how many of those dead were killed by our forces? How many innocents have fallen to weapons wielded by those who claim to fight for their liberation?" The answer, when it came, was like a blade thrust into his immortal heart. 17 million civilians had died in the crossfire between rebel and loyalist forces, caught in battles where both sides claimed to represent their interests. Another 8 million had perished in the chaos that followed Imperial withdrawals, falling victim to local warlords and criminal organizations that filled the power vacuum left by retreating authorities. Even the most charitable interpretation suggested that Vulcan's rebellion bore responsibility for the deaths of more innocents than it had saved. "The road to hell," Vulcan whispered, remembering words spoken by ancient Terran philosophers whose wisdom had survived the age of strife, "is paved with good intentions. I sought to save humanity from itself, yet I have become the architect of its greatest suffering. What does that make me, Xerus? What manner of monster clothes himself in righteousness while building pyramids from the skulls of the innocent?" The journey to Nocturn was undertaken in silence, Vulcan's flagship forge eternal, traveling through the warp with the weight of 10,000 years of accumulated guilt pressing down upon its Geller fields. He had not set foot upon his homeworld since the beginning of the rebellion, choosing to wage his war among distant stars rather than bring conflict to the place where his humanity had been forged. Now, as the ship emerged into real space, within sight of that volcanic world's fire-wreathed surface, he discovered that his efforts to protect Nocturn had been for naught. The orbital defenses that had stood sentinel over the Salamander's home for millennia were gone, reduced to spreading clouds of debris that caught the light of the system's primary star. In their place hung vessels bearing the heraldry of loyal Space Marine chapters, the Imperial fists, the Iron Hands, the Ultramarines, and others whose gene fathers had once called Vulcan brother. They had come not as liberators, but as executioners, charged with purging the homeworld of a Primarch, declared traitor by the very Imperium he had helped to build. The surface of Nocturn bore the scars of siege warfare that had raged for weeks. The great forges of Mount Deathfire smouldered beneath orbital bombardment, their ancient fires guttering like dying candles in the wind. Across the ash plains where Vulcan had once hunted salamanders with the Emperor himself, artillery craters marked where loyal salamanders had made their final stands against brothers who branded them heretics by association. It was in the ruins of Hesiod, the settlement where Vulcan had first learned the arts of metalworking from his adopted father, that he found them, the remnants of those salamanders who had remained loyal to the Imperium rather than follow their gene father into rebellion. They knelt in chains, forged from their own weapons, surrounded by space marines whose loyalty to Terra superseded any bonds of brotherhood or genetic kinship. Brother Captain Orthak, who had led the loyalist withdrawal from Medusa 7, looked up as Vulcan approached through the smoking rubble. His face bore the scars of recent battle, and his eyes held the hollow look of one who had watched everything he held sacred burn to ash around him. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound. "My lord," Orthak said, the title spoken with bitter irony, "you have come to witness the fruit of your labors. Behold, your loyal sons, branded as traitors by the Imperium they served faithfully for 10,000 years. Behold the children of Nocturn, scattered to distant worlds as refugees while their homes burn in the fires of your righteous war." Vulcan knelt beside his gene-son, his massive hands working to break the chains that bound him, despite the weapons trained upon them, both by the surrounding loyalists. "I never meant for this," he said, his voice thick with anguish that seemed to encompass the suffering of entire worlds. "I sought only to remind the galaxy what we were meant to protect. I never intended for innocent blood to flow like rivers, for families to be torn asunder, for my own sons to pay the price for their father's choices." "Intent matters little when weighed against consequence," replied a voice that carried the cold certainty of absolute conviction. Chapter Master Marneus Calgar of the Ultramarines approached through the ruins, his artificer armor bearing fresh battle scars from the siege of Nocturn. Behind him came warriors whose gene lineage traced back to Roboute Guilliman, their bolters trained upon the Primarch who had brought civil war to the galaxy. "Lord Vulcan," Calgar continued, his voice carefully modulated to show respect while maintaining unwavering resolve, "your rebellion has torn the Imperium asunder. Billions die while you pursue a dream that exists only in memory. The galaxy burns because you could not accept that perfection is the enemy of survival. That harsh order is preferable to compassionate chaos." The confrontation that followed was not one of weapons, but of words that cut deeper than any blade. Calgar spoke of duty fulfilled in the face of impossible choices, of the necessity that drove good men to commit acts that haunted their dreams. He painted a picture of the Imperium as humanity's only shield against the darkness, flawed perhaps, but essential for the species' survival. To tear it down in pursuit of an impossible ideal was not just folly, but a betrayal of every human who looked to the Emperor's servants for protection. "You speak of the Emperor's true vision," Calgar said, his voice growing stern with the authority of one who had never known defeat. "Yet you forget that he himself chose to become a tyrant when the galaxy's survival demanded it. The Imperium exists not because it is good, but because it works. Your father accepted that truth when he ascended the Golden Throne. Why can you not do the same?" Vulcan's response came from depths of pain that seemed to encompass the agony of every soul lost in the fires of his rebellion. "Because I have seen what we have become," he said, his words falling like hammer blows upon the assembled warriors. "I have watched commissars execute children for asking questions. I have seen entire populations starve while their world's tithes feed the luxury of distant nobles. I have witnessed cruelty elevated to doctrine and suffering enshrined as virtue." He gestured toward the ruins around them, where the bodies of civilians lay scattered among the wreckage of their homes. "Tell me, Calgar, how many innocents must die to maintain this necessary order? How much suffering must be endured before we admit that survival at any cost is no survival at all?" The debate that raged among the ruins of Hesiod became a microcosm of the larger war that convulsed the galaxy. Two visions of humanity's future clashed with words as their followers fought with bolter and blade across countless worlds. Calgar spoke for stability, order, and the grim necessity that had kept humanity alive for 10 millennia. Vulcan argued for compassion, growth, and the possibility that the species might aspire to something greater than mere existence. Yet even as they debated, the war continued its inexorable advance. Vox transmissions brought word of new atrocities committed by both sides, rebel forces executing Imperial officials without trial, loyalist troops bombing refugee camps suspected of harboring seditionists. The line between liberation and vengeance blurred until both sides seemed to mirror the very cruelty they claimed to oppose. It was then, surrounded by the wreckage of his homeworld and faced with the undeniable truth of his rebellion's cost, that Vulcan felt the weight of his perpetual nature for the first time as a curse rather than a gift. To be immortal meant to carry the burden of consequences forever. To live with the knowledge that every choice echoed through eternity, without the merciful release of death to provide forgetfulness. "I have become death," Vulcan whispered, the words torn from his throat like fragments of his own soul. Not the clean death of the warrior's blade, but the lingering death of unintended consequence. Every time I rise from destruction, I bring more suffering to those I sought to protect. Perhaps the galaxy would be better served if this resurrection were my last. Captain Xerus, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, stepped forward with the desperate urgency of one who sensed his gene father teetering on the edge of an abyss from which there might be no return. "My lord," he said, his voice carrying the weight of loyalty that transcended mere duty, "you speak of ending what cannot be ended. Your perpetual nature is not yours to cast aside. It is a gift from the Emperor himself, granted for purposes we may not understand, but which serve the greater good." "The greater good," Vulcan repeated, tasting the words like poison. "How many have died for that abstraction? How many more will perish before this greater good is achieved? I was created to protect humanity, Xerus. Yet everywhere I walk, human blood waters the soil. What manner of protector am I?" The answer came not from his gene son, but from the most unexpected source. Brother Captain Orthak, still kneeling in chains, yet speaking with the clarity of one who had found peace in the midst of suffering. "You are human, my lord," he said, his voice gentle despite the circumstances that had brought them together. "Flawed, fallible, capable of error despite your gene-enhanced nature. The Emperor did not create perfect beings. He created beings capable of growth, of learning, of becoming more than they were." Orthak's words carried the weight of 10,000 years of faithful service, of battles fought and won in defense of those who could not defend themselves. "This war you have begun will end, my lord, one way or another. The question is not whether it was right to start it, but what wisdom you will carry forward from its ashes. The dead cannot be restored, but the living can still be saved, if you choose to bear the burden of your choices rather than flee from them." As night fell over the ruins of Nocturn, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that reminded all present of the fires that had forged the Salamander's legion, Vulcan found himself standing at the crossroads of eternity. Behind him lay the ashes of his home world and the weight of consequences that would haunt him forever. Ahead stretched the uncertain future of a galaxy, caught between the dream of what it could become and the nightmare of what it had been. The choice he faced was simple, yet infinitely complex. Continue the rebellion despite its terrible cost, or find some other way to serve the vision he had glimpsed in the Emperor's words. Either path would require him to live with the knowledge that his immortality was not a blessing, but a responsibility that could never be set aside. In the distance, the forges of Mount Deathfire flickered back to life, as surviving salamanders began the work of rebuilding what war had destroyed. The flames that had birthed their legion still burned, waiting to forge new weapons, new hopes, new possibilities from the raw material of human suffering and determination. Whether those flames would consume everything in their path or kindle the light of a better tomorrow remained to be seen. But for the first time since his rebellion began, Vulcan understood that the answer lay not in the grand gestures of war, but in the quiet choices made by individual souls in the darkness of their most desperate hours. The test continued, and with it came the terrible gift of another chance to choose. The armadas of the Imperium converged upon the rebel sectors like the wrath of a dying god-given form, their passage through the void marked by the screams of reality itself, as thousands of vessels translated from warp to real space in perfect synchronization. 7 battle groups under the command of Lord Admiral Quintanus bore the combined might of 17 Space Marine chapters, 43 Titan legions, and more than 100 Imperial Guard regiments drawn from across the galaxy. This was not merely a military response. It was the Imperium's final answer to the question of whether compassion could survive in a universe built upon necessity. Standing in the strategium of Forge Eternal, as the enemy fleets closed like the jaws of a trap, Vulcan studied tactical displays that painted a picture of overwhelming odds. The mathematics of the engagement were stark in their simplicity. His rebellion commanded perhaps 1/10 of the firepower arrayed against them, their ships crewed by volunteers and refugees who possessed courage in abundance but lacked the training of veteran Imperial forces. Yet it was not the prospect of defeat that weighed most heavily upon the Primarch's mind, but the certainty that billions would die in the crossfire of the final battle. "My lord," Captain Xerus reported, his voice carrying the strain of sleepless nights spent planning defensive strategies that all knew were futile. "The evacuation fleets have reached maximum capacity. We can save perhaps 40 million civilians from the worlds that will burn in the coming assault. But the remainder must face whatever mercy the Imperium chooses to show." The number struck Vulcan like a physical blow, each digit representing countless lives that would be snuffed out in the name of order and stability. 200 million souls trapped on worlds that had declared for his cause, unable to flee before the Imperial hammer fell. Men, women, and children who had dared to hope for something better than endless suffering, now facing annihilation because they had believed in his message of liberation. "No," Vulcan said, the word emerging from depths of determination that had not wavered even in his darkest moments. "I will not permit the slaughter of innocents to serve as the final act of this drama. If the Imperium demands a reckoning, it shall have one, but not paid for with the blood of those I swore to protect." The decision that followed would be remembered as either the height of courage or the depths of madness, depending upon who lived to write the histories. Vulcan would go to terror itself, to the heart of Imperial power, where the High Lord sat in judgment upon the galaxy. There, in the halls where his father had once walked as both man and god, he would force a confrontation that would determine whether the Imperium could evolve beyond its current corruption, or whether it would choose to die rather than change. The journey to Holy Terror was undertaken alone, Vulcan traveling through routes known only to the Primarchs and their most trusted servants. Ancient pathways through the warp that predated the Imperium itself, sealed passages within the Imperial palace that had been forgotten by all, save those who had helped to build them 10,000 years before. His knowledge of these hidden ways came not from recent reconnaissance, but from memories of the Great Crusade, when he had walked those corridors beside brothers who now lay dead or damned. The Imperial palace at night was a thing of terrible beauty, its golden spires reaching toward stars that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. Yet as Vulcan moved through its forgotten depths, following maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the seat of human power, he saw none of its surface grandeur. Instead, he witnessed the hidden machinery that kept the Imperium functioning, the servitor pens where lobotomized humans performed endless labor, the processing centers where dissidents vanished into statistical abstractions, the chambers where inquisitors reviewed execution lists that contained more names than some worlds held citizens. It was in the depths beneath the throne room itself that Vulcan made his most chilling discovery: archives that contained detailed records of every atrocity committed in the Emperor's name over the past 10 millennia. Worlds burned for insufficient faith, populations culled for genetic impurity, children taken from their families to serve in armies they would never leave alive, all of it catalogued with bureaucratic precision, each entry signed with seals that bore the authority of the High Lords themselves. Yet it was not the existence of these records that shocked him most, but their organization. They were not random acts of cruelty committed by local officials, but parts of a deliberate pattern, a systematic campaign to drive the Imperium toward ever greater extremes of brutality. As Vulcan studied the files with growing horror, he began to perceive the outline of a plan so vast and terrible that it beggared comprehension. The Emperor had not merely permitted the corruption of his Imperium, he had actively encouraged it, fostering the growth of institutions that would push humanity toward its breaking point. Every excess, every cruelty, every act of institutionalized suffering had been part of a test designed to determine whether the species could recognize evil when it wore the mask of necessity and choose to reject it despite the cost. The ultimate test, Vulcan whispered, as understanding dawned like a cold sun rising over an empty world. Not of strength or faith, but of moral courage. How far would humanity sink before someone stood up and said, "No more"? How much suffering would they endure before recognizing that survival without dignity is no survival at all? The chamber where he found the High Lords was a monument to absolute power, its walls lined with the skulls of those who had opposed Imperial will throughout the millennia. 12 figures sat around a table carved from a single piece of Terran marble, their faces bearing the marks of authority exercised without mercy or restraint. They showed no surprise at his arrival. Perhaps they had always known this confrontation was inevitable, written into the very structure of the test they had helped to administer. "Lord Vulcan," spoke the master of the administratum, his voice carrying the dry precision of one who had reduced human suffering to statistics and found the mathematics acceptable. "We have been expecting you. Your rebellion has proceeded exactly as predicted in the most classified projections. You have played your role admirably." "Played my role?" Vulcan's voice carried the rumble of volcanic fury barely held in check. "You speak as if this were some performance for your entertainment rather than the genuine anguish of billions. Tell me, when you signed the orders for orbital bombardment, did you think of the children who would burn? When you authorized the execution of populations for the crime of hope, did you pause to consider the weight of their screams?" The Lord Commander Militant leaned forward, his augmetic eye whirring as it focused upon the Primarch's burning gaze. "We considered the necessity of maintaining order in a galaxy that would consume itself without firm guidance. Your father created us to make the hard choices that lesser minds cannot comprehend. If that requires the sacrifice of the few to save the many, we bear that burden gladly." The few. Vulcan's laugh was bitter as the ash that covered his homeworld. "You speak of billions as if they were mere numbers in your ledgers. 200 million dead in the crossfire of this war alone. 3 trillion living in conditions that would shame the most primitive savages. Entire sectors stripped bare to feed the gluttony of terror, while their populations starve in the darkness between stars. Around the table, the High Lords listened with the patience of those who had heard such accusations countless times before. Their responses came with the practiced ease of men who had spent lifetimes justifying the unjustifiable, who had elevated cruelty to doctrine and suffering to virtue. You offer alternatives without understanding consequences, the ecclesiarch said, his voice heavy with the weight of absolute faith. Remove the strong hand of imperial rule, and chaos fills the void. Permit questioning of authority, and order collapses into anarchy. Show mercy to the weak, and strength is perceived as weakness by enemies who would devour our species entirely. Yet what if the cure has become worse than the disease? Vulcan countered, his voice carrying the authority of one who had witnessed the birth of the Imperium and could judge what it had become. What if the strong hand you speak of has grown so heavy that it crushes everything it was meant to protect? What if your order has become indistinguishable from the chaos you claim to prevent? The debate that followed encompassed 10,000 years of imperial history, touching upon every justification that had been offered for the gradual corruption of the Emperor's dream. The High Lord spoke of pragmatism, of the harsh realities that made idealism a luxury humanity could not afford. They painted themselves as reluctant guardians bearing burdens too heavy for lesser souls to comprehend, making sacrifices that others were too weak to make. Vulcan listened to their arguments with the patience of stone, hearing in their words the echoes of every tyrant who had ever claimed necessity as justification for evil. When they finished their defense, his response came with the weight of divine judgment. You have forgotten the most fundamental truth of leadership, he said, his voice cutting through their protests like a blade through silk. Those who rule exist to serve those they govern, not the reverse. The moment you begin to see human beings as resources to be expended, rather than lives to be protected, you cease to be their guardians and become their oppressors. It was then that the Emperor's presence filled the chamber, his psychic voice reaching across the galaxy from the Golden Throne with power that made the very air shimmer with barely contained force. Yet his words, when they came, carried not the weight of command, but the gentle touch of a father speaking to a son who had finally understood the lesson he had been trying to teach. The test nears its completion, the Emperor said, his voice touching every mind present with perfect clarity. For 10,000 years, I have waited for someone to stand before these corrupt servants and speak the truth they have forgotten, not through force or compulsion, but through moral courage that refuses to accept that cruelty is necessary. The revelation that followed shattered every assumption that had governed imperial policy for millennia. The Emperor had not been a passive observer of his realm's corruption, but its architect, fostering the growth of institutions that would push humanity toward its breaking point, so that eventually someone would be strong enough to say, "No more," and mean it. "The choice is yours, my son," the Emperor continued, his presence growing stronger as the moment of decision approached. You could destroy these servants of corruption, scatter their ashes to the void, and begin again with rulers who remember their purpose. Or you could do something far more difficult. Forgive them, teach them, help them become worthy of the trust they have betrayed. Vulcan looked upon the faces of the High Lords, seeing in them not monsters, but broken souls who had forgotten what they were meant to serve. The power to destroy them lay within his grasp. Doomtremor's flames could reduce them all to ash in moments, clearing the way for new leadership that might remember compassion. Yet as he contemplated that choice, he heard again the words of Brother Captain Orthak, spoken in the ruins of Nocturn. The Emperor did not create perfect beings. He created beings capable of growth. No, Vulcan said finally, his voice carrying the weight of decision that would echo through history. I will not become the very thing I have fought against. If this Imperium is to be saved, it must choose to save itself. If these leaders are to become worthy of their stations, they must earn that worthiness through their own actions, not have it imposed upon them through fear. The choice made, Vulcan raised Doomtremor not as a weapon, but as a symbol, its flames blazing with light that cast no shadows. I offer you mercy, he said to the High Lords who sat frozen in amazement at being spared. Not because you deserve it, but because mercy is the only force that can break the cycles of vengeance that have consumed this galaxy. Learn from this moment. Remember what you have forgotten. Become worthy of the trust that billions have placed in you. And if they refuse? Asked the Master of the Administratum, his voice trembling with emotions that had not touched him in decades. If they return to their old ways the moment you depart? Vulcan's smile was sad, as starlight reflected in still water. Then they will face the judgment of their own consciences, and the galaxy will know that they were given the chance to choose redemption and rejected it. Sometimes the possibility of change is more powerful than any forced transformation. As he prepared to depart the chamber where the fate of trillions had been decided, Vulcan felt the weight of prophecy settling upon his shoulders like a mantle of lead and starlight. The test was not yet complete. It might never be complete, but for the first time in 10,000 years, the Imperium had been forced to confront the question of whether survival justified any cost. The answer to that question would be written in the choices made by billions of individual souls in the days to come. But at least now, they would be choosing with eyes open to the truth of what they had become and what they might yet be. The anvil had been struck, and the shape of the galaxy's future would be determined by whether the metal proved strong enough to hold its new form, or whether it would shatter under the weight of its own contradictions. In the depths of the Imperial Palace, as alarms began to wail and security forces mobilized in response to his presence, Vulcan walked toward an uncertain future with the certainty that some choices were worth making regardless of their consequences. The test continued, and with it came the hope that even the darkest souls might yet find their way back to the light. The transformation began not with the thunder of bolter fire or the roar of orbital bombardment, but with silence, the profound quiet that fell across the Imperial Palace as news of Vulcan's mercy spread through halls that had not known such gestures for 10 millennia. The High Lords sat in their chamber of power, alive when they had expected death, grappling with emotions they had thought long dead as they contemplated the choice that had been offered to them. Around them, the machinery of imperial governance ground to a halt as administrators and functionaries struggled to understand what it meant that a Primarch had shown mercy to those who deserved none. Yet it was not enough for Vulcan to simply spare their lives and depart. If the Imperium was to change, if the High Lords were to remember what they were meant to serve rather than whom they were meant to rule, they would need to see with their own eyes the consequences of the choices they had made from the safety of their marble halls. "Come," Vulcan commanded, as he stood before the 12 figures who governed the fate of trillions, his voice carrying authority that had been granted not by appointment, but by divine creation. "You will accompany me to see what your orders have wrought. You will look upon the faces of those who suffer for your convenience, and you will explain to them why their agony was necessary." The journey that followed took the High Lords from the gilded corridors of terror to the underhives of Necromunda, where families huddled in darkness because their world's energy output had been diverted to feed the capital's endless hunger. They walked through the industrial wastelands of Mordian, where children worked 16-hour shifts in manufactorums because their quotas demanded it. They stood in the ruins of Vos Tertius, where an entire civilization had been abandoned to die rather than receive aid that might have compromised production schedules. At each stop, Vulcan forced them to speak with the survivors, to look into eyes that held no hope, to listen to voices that had grown hoarse from screaming protests that no one would hear. The master of the Administratum, who had reduced human suffering to statistical abstractions for centuries, found himself face to face with a woman whose children had starved while warehouses full of food rotted in customs depots because the proper paperwork had been delayed. "Explain to her," Vulcan said, his voice cutting through the administrative officials' stammered attempts at justification. "Why your efficiency was more important than her family's survival. Tell her about the greater good that required her sacrifice." The Lord Commander, militant, architect of 1,000 military campaigns that had claimed billions of lives, knelt before a crippled veteran whose regiment had been ordered to hold an impossible position, not for strategic gain, but to satisfy the pride of a distant general. The soldier's augmetic limbs spoke of wounds that could have been avoided, of orders that prioritized glory over the lives of those who carried them out. "This is the cost of your tactical doctrine," Vulcan observed, as the veteran recounted the battle that had taken his humanity piece by piece. "Not numbers on a data slate, but flesh and blood, and dreams that will never be fulfilled. How many more like him exist across the galaxy? How many more will you create in service to plans drawn in ignorance of their true price?" Yet even as the High Lords grappled with revelations that shattered decades of comfortable assumptions, Vulcan's true message was already spreading across the galaxy in ways that no force could contain. The broadcast he initiated from the Imperial Palace's own communication arrays carried not accusations or demands for vengeance, but simple truth spoken with the authority of one who had witnessed the birth of the Imperium and could judge what it had become. "Citizens of the galaxy," his words thundered across the void, reaching every listening post and vox receiver within 100 sectors. "For too long you have been told that your suffering serves a greater purpose, that your children must die so that others might live, that freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength, and mercy is weakness. Today I tell you that those who speak such lies have forgotten the most basic truth of civilization, that governments exist to serve their people, not the reverse." The response was immediate and overwhelming. On Catachan, jungle fighters who had spent their lives following orders without question began to ask why their world's youth were conscripted to die on distant battlefields while local threats went unaddressed. On Valhalla, ice warriors questioned why their planet's mineral wealth was shipped to forge worlds while their own people froze in inadequate shelters. Across the galaxy, populations that had endured millennia of casual cruelty suddenly found voices they had thought silenced forever. Yet it was not just civilians who heard Vulcan's message and found it resonating with doubts they had long suppressed. In the halls of the Inquisition itself, agents who had spent centuries purging heretics began to question whether the greatest heresy might be the system they served. Inquisitor Vex, who had once declared that even Primarchs must bow to Inquisitorial authority, stood in his chambers aboard the Divine Judgment and watched reports of uprisings across 17 sectors with something approaching wonder. "Perhaps," he said to his aide Seraphine, his voice carrying uncertainty that had not marked his words since his earliest days of service, "we have been asking the wrong questions. not whether people deserve freedom, but whether we deserve the authority to deny it to them. The fracture lines that had existed within imperial institutions for millennia suddenly became chasms, as those who remembered why they had first taken up arms in humanity's service found themselves at odds with those who had forgotten everything save the exercise of power. 3 inquisitors of the Order Hereticus publicly declared their support for Vulcan's message, stating that the greatest corruption in the galaxy was not chaos worship, but the systemic cruelty that made chaos attractive to those who had lost all hope. Chapter Master Lysander of the Imperial Fists, who had faced Vulcan in combat and been spared through mercy he had never expected, stood before his assembled warriors and spoke words that would echo through the Adeptus Astartes for generations to come. "We were created to be humanity's protectors," he said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries spent in faithful service, "not its oppressors. If we have forgotten that distinction, then we have failed not just our oaths, but the very purpose for which we were made." The ecclesiarchy, that vast machine for the manufacture of faith, found itself torn between those who proclaimed that change was heresy and those who declared that resistance to positive change was the true betrayal of the Emperor's will. Cardinal Astrophen of the Segmentum Solar stood before the greatest cathedral on Terra and delivered a sermon that would be remembered as either the height of wisdom or the depths of apostasy, depending upon the listener's perspective. "For 10,000 years, he said, his words carrying to millions of pilgrims gathered in the cathedral's vastness, we have preached that suffering brings us closer to the Emperor, that pain purifies the soul, and hardship proves our devotion. Yet I ask you, when the Emperor walked among us, did he demand that children starve to prove their faith? Did he order the execution of the innocent to demonstrate their loyalty? Or did he sacrifice himself upon the golden throne precisely so that such things would not be necessary? The schism that followed would reshape the imperial faith for centuries to come. Reformist cardinals spoke of an emperor who valued compassion over compliance, who had dreamed of a galaxy where humanity might know peace rather than endless war. Traditionalist bishops countered that such thinking was heresy, that the emperor's sacrifice demanded reciprocal suffering from his followers, that any deviation from established doctrine was a betrayal of 10,000 years of faithful service. Yet even as institutions fractured and ancient hierarchies crumbled, new forms of order began to emerge from the chaos. On worlds where populations had risen against their oppressors, citizen councils formed to replace governors who had ruled through fear alone. Veterans of the Imperial Guard who had grown sick of pointless campaigns organized themselves into defensive militias dedicated to protecting rather than conquering. Space Marine chapters that had joined Vulcan's cause began working alongside local populations rather than ruling over them. The changes were not uniformly positive. Chaos filled some voids left by departing authorities, and some worlds descended into anarchy as competing factions struggled for control. Yet for every failure, there were dozens of successes, communities that discovered they could govern themselves more effectively than distant bureaucrats who viewed them as resources rather than people. On Terra itself, the High Lords who had accompanied Vulcan on his journey of revelation returned to their chambers, changed in ways that they struggled to understand. The Master of the Administratum sat before data slates that showed efficiency ratings and production quotas, yet found himself seeing not numbers, but the faces of those who would suffer to achieve them. The Lord Commander Militant reviewed strategic assessments that called for sacrificing entire regiments to achieve marginal advantages, yet could not forget the veteran who had paid the price of such calculations. "What would you have us do?" asked the Fabricator General, his augmetic voice carrying confusion that his ancient cogitators struggled to process. The Imperium requires governance. Decisions must be made. Orders must be given. How do we proceed when every choice carries the weight of suffering you have shown us? Vulcan's answer came with the gentle authority of one who had spent millennia learning to balance idealism with reality. You proceed with the knowledge that every life matters, he said, his voice carrying certainty that cut through their confusion like a beacon in darkness. You make decisions not from the safety of marble halls, but with the understanding that real people will bear the consequences of your choices. You govern not as masters but as servants, remembering always that power is a burden, not a privilege. The process of transformation would take decades, perhaps centuries to complete. The Imperium was too vast, too complex, too entrenched in its ways to change overnight. Yet as reports flooded in from across the galaxy, of populations refusing to accept impossible quotas, of commanders choosing to protect civilians rather than achieve military objectives, of administrators seeking to serve rather than rule, it became clear that something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between the Imperium and humanity. The chain of oppression that had bound the galaxy for 10 millennia had been broken not through force of arms, but through the simple recognition that it need not exist. Vulcan's choice to show mercy rather than exact vengeance had done what no amount of rebellion could achieve. It had reminded both rulers and ruled that change was possible, that suffering was not inevitable, that the dream of a better galaxy was worth fighting for. In his private chambers within the Imperial Palace, as reports of transformation echoed from across the stars, Vulcan reflected upon the path that had brought him to this moment. The rebellion that had begun with his desperate intervention on Medusa 7 had evolved into something far greater. Not a war of conquest, but a revolution of consciousness. Not the destruction of the old order, but its redemption. The hardest victory, he said to Captain Xerus, who had remained by his side through every trial the rebellion had brought, is not the one won through strength of arms, but the one achieved through strength of character. Any fool with sufficient firepower can destroy that which offends him. It takes wisdom to transform it into something worthy of preservation. The forge fires of 1,000 worlds burned bright against the void, their light no longer fueled solely by the hunger for war, but by hope for something better. The chains had been broken, and in their place grew bonds forged not from compulsion, but from choice, connections between governor and governed, protector and protected, that drew strength from mutual respect rather than fear. The galaxy would never be perfect. Too much damage had been done over too many millennia for complete healing to be possible. Yet for the first time since the Emperor's enthronement upon the Golden Throne, humanity had been reminded that progress was possible, that mercy was strength, and that the dream of unity through compassion was not just a legend from a bygone age, but a future that could still be achieved. The revolution continued, not through the thunder of guns, but through the whispered conversations of those who dared to hope that tomorrow might be better than today. And in that hope lay the strongest foundation upon which to build a galaxy worthy of the sacrifices that had brought it into being. The great bell of terror chimed across the galaxy as the Imperium formally acknowledged what had already become reality in countless sectors. The age of rule through fear alone had ended. The imperial decree that emerged from the High Lord's deliberations bore the seal of every major institution that governed humanity's scattered worlds. Yet it read not like the brutal edicts of millennia past, but like a promise made to children who had suffered too long in darkness. By the authority of the High Lords of Terror, Acting in accordance with the Emperor's divine will, the decree proclaimed across 1,000 Vox networks, no citizen of the Imperium shall be subject to execution without formal trial. No population shall be culled for failing to meet impossible quotas. No world shall be abandoned to die for the crime of requesting aid. The Imperium exists to serve humanity, not the reverse, and those who forget this truth forfeit their right to govern in the Emperor's name. The words seemed simple, almost mundane to those who had never lived under the boot of imperial tyranny. Yet to the trillions who had endured millennia of casual brutality, they represented something revolutionary, the recognition that their lives held inherent value beyond their utility as resources to be consumed. On Mordian, factory workers wept openly as they realized their children would not be pressed into service at age 12. On Katashan, jungle fighters discovered that their world's youth could choose their own paths rather than face automatic conscription into the Imperial Guard. Yet it was not enough for Vulcan to simply proclaim change. If the transformation was to take root and flourish, those displaced by the old order's collapse would need places of sanctuary where new ways could be practiced and proven. Across 17 sectors, worlds that had declared for his cause began establishing refugee settlements that would serve as both havens for the displaced and laboratories for the forms of governance that the Imperium might yet become. The first of these sanctuaries rose on Caliban's ruins, where the ancient forests had begun to reclaim the industrial scars left by millennia of exploitation. Here, Vulcan himself worked alongside former Imperial officials and civilian volunteers to build something unprecedented, a city governed not by the whims of distant bureaucrats, but by councils elected from among its inhabitants. The refugees who came seeking shelter found not charity, but opportunity, the chance to help create the very society in which they would live. "Every voice matters," Vulcan declared as he stood before the settlement's first council meeting, his massive frame somehow managing to appear humble despite its imposing nature. Not because every voice is wise, wisdom must be earned through experience and reflection, but because every person who will live with the consequences of a decision deserves a say in making it. This is not weakness disguised as democracy, but strength expressed through the courage to trust in humanity's capacity for growth. The work was neither easy nor uniformly successful. Some settlements descended into faction fighting as competing groups struggled to define their vision of the future. Others became paralyzed by endless debate as councils discovered that reaching consensus was far more difficult than following orders. Yet for every failure, there were dozens of successes, communities that learned to govern themselves with wisdom and compassion, proving that the dream of peaceful coexistence was not merely idealistic fantasy, but achievable reality. It was during the establishment of the seventh sanctuary that Vulcan received word that would reshape his understanding of what his rebellion had truly accomplished. A small fleet bearing the heraldry of the 13th Legion had translated into the system's edge, their hulls scarred by warp transit, yet their message unmistakable. Roboute Guilliman had awakened from his millennia-long stasis and come to see what his brother had wrought. The meeting between the two Primarchs took place in the amphitheatre of New Macraga, the settlement that had grown from the ashes of an imperial governor's palace. Guilliman approached with the measured stride of one who had built an empire through careful planning and methodical execution, his armor of fate gleaming in the light of 3 suns. Yet his expression held none of the stern disapproval that Vulcan had expected. Instead, there was something approaching wonder as he surveyed the ordered prosperity of the refugee settlement. "Brother," Guilliman said, his voice carrying the warmth of genuine affection, tempered by 10,000 years of bitter experience. "When I first heard reports of your rebellion, I feared that grief had driven you to madness. The galaxy burns with civil war, entire sectors torn asunder by competing claims of righteousness and necessity. Yet what I see here," he gestured toward the settlement spread below them, where human and abhuman children played together, while their parents debated matters of governance in halls where once only the nobility had been permitted to tread. "What I see here suggests that perhaps madness was exactly what this galaxy needed." Their conversation lasted through the night and into the following dawn, two sons of the Emperor grappling with the legacy of choices that had reshaped the fate of worlds. Guilliman spoke of his awakening to find the Imperium transformed beyond all recognition, its bureaucratic machinery grown so complex and corrupted that it bore little resemblance to the efficient administration he had crafted in the aftermath of the heresy. "The Codex Astartes," he said with bitter irony, "has become a straitjacket rather than a guide, stifling innovation in the name of orthodoxy. The worlds I once governed with justice and prosperity now groan under the weight of tithes that serve no purpose save to feed the appetites of those who have forgotten what governance means. Perhaps your way, messy, chaotic, uncertain though it may be, offers hope for redemption that my careful systems could not provide." The reconciliation that followed was not merely political, but deeply personal, as Vulcan found himself facing the return of loyalist salamanders who had branded him traitor, yet could not deny the evidence of what his rebellion had achieved. Brother Captain Orthak led a delegation of 300 Marines who knelt not in submission, but in acknowledgement that their Gene Father's vision had proved wiser than their adherence to doctrine. "My lord," Orthak said, as he rose from his genuflection, his scarred features reflecting emotions too complex for easy categorization, "we have witnessed the fruits of imperial orthodoxy, worlds burned, populations culled, hope extinguished in the name of order. We have also witnessed the fruits of your rebellion, mercy where there was once cruelty, growth where there was once stagnation, hope where there was once only despair. If we erred in choosing doctrine over conscience, then let our service to your vision redeem the mistake." The ceremony of reunification took place in the great forge chambers of Nocturn, where Vulcan had returned to find his homeworld slowly healing from the wounds of siege warfare. The loyal and rebel factions of his legion knelt together before the anvils where their Primarch had first learned to shape metal into tools of creation rather than destruction. Yet this time, the weapons he forged were not meant for war, but for protection, artifacts that would guard the refugee settlements and new communities against those who would drag them back into the darkness of the old order. The first of these new artifacts was the Beacon of Sanctuary, a device that generated a psychic field capable of calming the most violent impulses and encouraging rational discourse. The second was the Shield of Voices, a protective barrier that could deflect not just physical attacks, but the mental conditioning that had kept Imperial populations docile for millennia. Each creation bore inscriptions in a dozen languages, their messages speaking not of conquest and glory, but of hope and the promise that even the darkest nights must eventually yield to dawn. "These are not weapons of war," Vulcan explained to the assembled salamanders as he placed the final touches on the Forge of New Beginnings, an artifact that could transform even the most poisoned soil into fertile ground for growth, but tools of healing. For too long, we have defined strength as the ability to destroy our enemies. I offer a different definition. Strength as the courage to help our enemies become our friends. The transformation of the salamanders themselves served as a microcosm of the changes sweeping the Imperium. Squads that had once specialized in urban warfare and siege breaking were retrained as disaster relief specialists and refugee protection units. Veterans who had spent centuries perfecting the arts of destruction found new purpose in teaching civilians how to defend their communities without becoming the very monsters they sought to resist. Captain Zeros, whose loyalty had never wavered throughout the darkest days of the rebellion, stood beside his Gene father as reports arrived of similar transformations occurring across the galaxy. The Imperial fists were establishing educational academies on worlds that had never known literacy. The Ultramarines were sharing the administrative techniques that had once been jealously guarded secrets of their chapter. Even the Iron Hands, traditionally the most mechanically focused of the Astartes, were teaching civilians how to maintain and repair the technology upon which their lives depended. The other legions stir, Xerus reported, as new vessels bearing primarchal heraldry appeared at the edge of sensor range. Leman Russ has sent word from Fenris that he comes to hunt not enemies, but solutions. The Lion himself has awakened and speaks of redemption for sins both past and present. They come not as conquerors or judges, but as brothers seeking to understand what miracle you have wrought. Yet perhaps the most significant transformation was occurring not in the grand gestures of primarchs and legions, but in the quiet choices made by ordinary citizens who had discovered that they possessed voices worth hearing. On 1,000 worlds, population councils had formed to work alongside planetary governors rather than simply serving their whims. Imperial Guard regiments were restructuring themselves as defensive militias, their loyalty redirected from distant terror to the communities they had sworn to protect. The ecclesiarchy itself had undergone a fundamental schism that ultimately proved beneficial, as reformist cardinals established new cathedrals dedicated not to the worship of the emperor as tyrant god, but to the reverence of his vision of human unity and compassion. These new churches served not as centers of dogmatic indoctrination, but as community gathering places where citizens could come together to debate, learn, and find common ground in their shared humanity. Faith, declared Cardinal Astrophan in a sermon that was broadcast across 17 sectors, is not the suspension of reason, but its fulfillment. We have faith not that the Emperor will solve all our problems, but that he has given us the wisdom and strength to solve them ourselves. We worship not his power, but his love, not his dominion, but his dream of what humanity might become. The economic transformations proved equally dramatic, as worlds that had spent millennia shipping their wealth to Terra began redirecting their resources toward local needs and mutual aid networks that spanned entire sectors. Trade routes that had once served only to enrich distant nobles became conduits for the exchange of knowledge, technology, and cultural innovations that benefited all participants. On the Forge world of Griffone 4, Magos Harath 9 stood before an assembly of tech adepts and delivered words that would have been branded heretical mere months before. The Omnissiah's greatest gift to humanity was not the machine, but the knowledge to improve our condition through technological progress. We have hoarded that knowledge like misers clutching coins while the galaxy burned around us. No more. Let the dark age of technological ignorance end, and let a new age of shared understanding begin. Yet even as these transformations took root and flourished, Vulcan knew that the work was far from complete. The Imperium was too vast, too complex, too deeply entrenched in its old ways to change overnight. There would be setbacks, reversals, moments when fear and hatred would temporarily triumph over hope and compassion. The forces of chaos still lurked beyond the galaxy's rim, watching for signs of weakness that might provide opportunities for invasion. Other threats, the Tyrannid fleets, the Necron dynasties, the myriad Xenos empires that saw humanity as nothing more than prey, remained as dangerous as ever. Change is not a destination, but a journey, Vulcan said, as he stood in the council chambers of New Terra, the city that had grown from the ashes of an imperial hive to become a beacon of what democratic governance might achieve. And journeys are measured not by their endpoints, but by the wisdom gained along the way. We have proven that transformation is possible, that mercy can triumph over cruelty, that cooperation can achieve more than compulsion. Now we must prove that these gains can endure. The fire that had begun as rebellion had become something far greater, a renaissance of the human spirit that touched every aspect of imperial society. Artists created works that celebrated life rather than glorifying death. Scientists pursued research aimed at healing rather than harming. Soldiers trained to protect rather than conquer. In the space of less than 100 days, the Imperium had rediscovered virtues it had thought lost forever, virtues that its founder had always hoped would define humanity's place among the stars. As Vulcan worked at his forge in the heart of Nocturn's greatest mountain, shaping metal into forms that had never before existed in the galaxy's long and bloody history, he reflected upon the magnitude of what had been accomplished. The dream that had begun with a single act of intervention on Medusa, 7 had grown into a transformation that touched the lives of trillions. The fire of Prometheus had been given to humanity, not through theft or trickery, but through the simple recognition that they had always possessed it. They had merely needed someone to remind them how to kindle its flames. The sound of hammer on anvil rang across the chamber, like a bell tolling the dawn of a new age, each strike forging not just metal, but the very future of human civilization. And in that rhythm lay the promise that the best days of the Imperium were not behind it, but still to come, waiting to be shaped by hands that remembered the difference between creation and destruction, between service and domination, between the nightmare of eternal war and the dream of enduring peace. The great forge fires of Nocturn burned with a different light than they had for 10,000 years, their flames reflecting not the hunger for war, but the patient work of creation that had always been the Salamander's truest calling. In the depths of Mount Deathfire, where the planet's molten heart met the cool touch of surface air, Vulcan worked at his ancient anvil with the contentment of one who had finally found his proper purpose. The hammer that had once shaped weapons of conquest now forged tools of growth, its rhythm marking not the cadence of march to war, but the steady pulse of a galaxy slowly healing from millennia of self-inflicted wounds. 1 year had passed since the last of the imperial decrees had been signed, since the final refugee settlement had declared its independence from the old ways of governance, since the transformation that history would remember as the Promethean reformation had reached its initial completion. Yet Vulcan knew, with the wisdom of one who had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, that endings were merely new beginnings in disguise. The work of rebuilding civilization was measured not in months or years, but in generations, each one carrying forward the lessons learned through suffering and the hope earned through sacrifice. The reports that reached him in his voluntary exile spoke of a galaxy transformed beyond recognition. On Terra itself, the High Lords who had once ruled through fear now governed through consensus, their marble halls echoing not with the screams of the condemned, but with the voices of citizens who had rediscovered their right to be heard. The Adeptus Administratum, that vast bureaucratic engine that had ground human dignity into statistical abstractions, had restructured itself around principles of service rather than domination. Even the Inquisition, most feared of Imperial institutions, had begun to define heresy not as questioning authority, but as the abuse of power itself. "The galaxy remembers," Captain Xeris reported, as he delivered the latest communications from across 17 sectors, his scarred features reflecting the satisfaction of duty well performed. "They call you the Guardian Primarch, my lord. Not for the worlds you conquered, but for the souls you saved. Children born in the refugee settlements learn your name alongside their letters, not as a warrior god to be feared, but as the father who taught humanity to remember its own worth." Vulcan smiled as he shaped molten adamantine into forms that had never existed before, agricultural implements that could coax life from the most barren soil, medical devices that could heal wounds, both physical and psychological, teaching tools that could kindle curiosity rather than crush it beneath the weight of doctrine. Each creation bore inscriptions in the ancient Nocturnian script that spoke not of conquest and glory, but of growth and the promise that even the smallest flame could light the darkness. "They honor me more than I deserve," he said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of one who had learned to measure success not in victories won, but in suffering prevented. "The Reformation bears my name, but it was achieved by millions of souls who chose courage over comfort, hope over despair. I merely reminded them that the choice was theirs to make." The transformation had not been without cost. No change of such magnitude ever was. Some worlds had descended into chaos as competing factions struggled to fill the power vacuum left by departing Imperial governors. Others had fallen prey to Xenos incursions when their defenders chose mercy over military efficiency. The forces of chaos, ever watchful for signs of weakness, had launched 3 major invasions that had been repelled only through the combined efforts of reformed Imperial forces and civilian militias fighting to protect homes they had helped to build. Yet for every setback, there had been dozens of triumphs that spoke to the resilience of the human spirit when freed from the chains of hopelessness. Agricultural worlds that had spent millennia shipping their harvests to distant terra, while their own populations starved, had become beacons of prosperity, their surplus shared with neighboring systems through trade networks based on mutual benefit rather than exploitation. Industrial planets had transformed their production lines to create goods that enhanced life, rather than simply feeding the endless hunger of war. The Space Marine chapters themselves had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation of all, evolving from warriors of conquest into guardians of peace. The Imperial Fists now served as disaster relief specialists, their expertise in fortification redirected toward building homes for the displaced rather than bunkers for the privileged. The Ultramarines had become teachers and administrators, sharing the knowledge that had once been jealously guarded secrets of their chapter with any who sought to learn. Even the most combat-oriented chapters had found new purpose in protecting trade routes and defending settlements against the predators that thrived in chaos. "Brother Captain Lysander sends word from the Mordian system," Xeris continued, his voice carrying notes of wonder that had become common when discussing the reformed chapters. "The Imperial Fists have completed construction of 17 new settlements for refugees from the Chaos incursions. He reports that their work brings them greater satisfaction than any victory they achieved during the old campaigns. They have rediscovered what it means to build, rather than merely tear down." The ecclesiarchy had perhaps undergone the most fundamental philosophical transformation, evolving from an institution that preached the necessity of suffering into one that celebrated the Emperor's vision of human potential. Cardinal Astrophan's reforms had spread across thousands of worlds, replacing cathedrals dedicated to martyrdom with community centers focused on education and mutual aid. The new prayers spoke not of humanity's unworthiness, but of its divine heritage as children of the Emperor's dream. Faith, the Cardinal had declared in his latest sermon, broadcast across the reformed sectors, is not the abandonment of reason, but its highest expression. We have faith not that the Emperor will solve our problems for us, but that he has given us the wisdom and strength to solve them ourselves. We worship not his power, but his love, not his dominion, but his dream of what we might become if we choose to be worthy of his sacrifice. Yet it was in the responses from ordinary citizens that Vulcan found the greatest validation of his choices. Letters arrived daily from across the galaxy, from factory workers who had learned to read thanks to Salamander literacy programs, from farmers who had discovered new cultivation techniques shared by reformed Mechanicus adepts, from children who grew up believing that the future could be better than the past because they had witnessed transformation with their own eyes. One letter, written in the careful script of someone still learning to form letters, came from a young woman on Vos Tertius, whose family had been among the refugees Vulcan had saved during his first intervention. "Lord Vulcan," it read, "my daughter asks me to tell you that she wants to be like you when she grows up. Not a warrior, but a protector. Not someone who destroys, but someone who builds. She has started learning to work metal in the settlement forges, and she says her first creation will be a flower made of steel, something beautiful that will never wilt, to remind people that even in the darkest times, beauty can bloom." It was while reading such testimonies that Vulcan received a communication that would reshape his understanding of everything he had accomplished. The message came not through conventional Vox channels, but through the psychic communion that had always existed between the Emperor and his sons, carrying with it the weight of 10,000 years of accumulated wisdom and the satisfaction of a plan finally come to fruition. "My most faithful son," the Emperor's voice reached across the galaxy with warmth that had been absent from their previous communications. "You have exceeded even my highest hopes. The reformation you have achieved was not merely the salvation of the Imperium. It was the prevention of humanity's moral collapse, the rescue of our species' soul from the abyss into which it was falling." The revelation that followed completed Vulcan's understanding of the cosmic game in which he had unknowingly participated. The Emperor had foreseen that the Imperium's gradual corruption would eventually reach a tipping point where it would collapse entirely, taking with it any hope of human survival in a galaxy filled with threats beyond mortal comprehension. The systematic fostering of cruelty and tyranny had not been an end in itself, but a desperate gamble. Push the system to its breaking point and hope that someone would emerge with the strength to say no more before it was too late. The test was not whether humanity could endure suffering, the Emperor explained, his presence growing stronger as the connection deepened, but whether it could recognize when that suffering had become pointless and find the courage to choose a different path. "You were not the only son I hoped would play this role. Any of your brothers might have served, had they survived to see what the Imperium had become. Yet fate chose you, my gentle giant, my most compassionate warrior, and you proved worthy of the trust I placed in you before your birth." The weight of this revelation might have crushed a lesser soul, but Vulcan had long since learned to bear burdens that would break ordinary minds. To know that every act of cruelty he had witnessed, every innocent life lost to Imperial indifference, had been part of a vast design to save humanity from itself, was almost unbearable. Yet he also knew that the alternative, allowing the slow decay to continue until the Imperium collapsed entirely, would have meant the extinction of their species. "The price," Vulcan whispered, his voice thick with the weight of cosmic responsibility. The billions who died while we waited for someone to say, "Enough." How do we justify such suffering, even in service to a greater good? The Emperor's response carried the sadness of ages, the burden of choices that had shaped the fate of species, and the wisdom that came from seeing all possible futures laid bare. We justify it by ensuring that their sacrifice was not meaningless, that the world we build honors their memory by being worthy of the price they paid. Every life saved by the Reformation, every child born into a galaxy where mercy matters more than might, every soul that chooses compassion over cruelty, these are the true monuments to those we could not save. As the psychic connection faded, leaving Vulcan alone once more with his forge and his thoughts, he found himself contemplating not the weight of cosmic purpose, but the simple satisfaction of work well done. The hammer in his hands felt lighter somehow, no longer burdened by the necessity of violence, but freed to pursue the creative calling that had always been his truest nature. The sound of young voices outside his workshop drew him from his reflections. Through the reinforced windows that looked out upon Nocturn's ash plains, he could see a group of children from the nearby settlement gathered around one of his apprentices, a former Imperial Guard sergeant who had learned that teaching metallurgy brought him more joy than commanding troops ever had. The children listened with rapt attention as the man explained the properties of different alloys, their eyes bright with the curiosity that the old Imperium had spent millennia trying to crush. "Master Vulcan," called one of the children as she noticed him watching from the window, her voice carrying the fearless enthusiasm of youth. "Will you teach us to make something beautiful today? Something that helps instead of hurts?" The request brought a smile to Vulcan's lips as he set down his hammer and moved toward the workshop's entrance. Here was the true victory of the Promethean Reformation, not the military triumphs or political transformations, but the simple fact that children could grow up believing that their purpose was to create rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm, to build bridges between souls rather than walls between cultures. "Of course, young ones," he said, as he opened the workshop doors to welcome them inside, his voice carrying the warmth of a teacher who had finally found his proper students. "Today we will forge something that has never existed before, a tool for making gardens bloom in the darkest soil. But first, you must understand the most important lesson of the forge. The metal remembers every blow, every flame, every moment of shaping. What we create must be worthy of the effort we put into making it." As the children gathered around his anvil, their faces lit by the forge fires that had burned since the earliest days of human civilization, Vulcan began to teach them not just the techniques of metalworking, but the philosophy that should guide all creation. Each hammer blow was a choice between destruction and construction. Each shaped piece of metal was a promise to future generations that beauty and utility could coexist. Each completed work was a small victory against the darkness that had once consumed the galaxy. Outside the workshop, the twin suns of the Nocturn system cast their light across a world that had learned to value life over death, growth over stagnation, hope over despair. In the distance, the communication arrays that connected this small planet to the broader galaxy carried messages of joy and discovery from worlds that had rediscovered what it meant to be human. The eternal flame burned bright in the hearts of trillions, a fire that no darkness could extinguish because it was fed not by hatred or fear, but by the simple recognition that every soul possessed infinite worth. Vulcan had lit that flame through his rebellion, but it would be carried forward by generations yet unborn, each one adding their own fuel to its light. The hammer fell upon the anvil with the rhythm of eternity itself, shaping not just metal, but the very future of human civilization. And in that workshop, on a volcanic world at the galaxy's edge, surrounded by children whose dreams reached toward stars unclouded by the smoke of war, the Guardian Primarch found the peace that had eluded him for 10,000 years. The dream endured, the flame burned eternal, and humanity at last remembered what it meant to hope.